In other news, some jackass named Casey just started recording 2.5 minutes ago. So I'm going to leave you a nice edit. So in case you want to cut all that,
I'm going to kill you.
I know. I know.
No, your punishment is I'm going to have to use the low quality Zoom version for your opening banter.
That is also completely acceptable. No joke. But do you want me to leave you like a nice let's start with follow up right now?
Do you need to have a checklist, Casey?
I do. I
suggested that Merlin have a checklist. And maybe you need a checklist too.
It's been a long time, and the problem is, I was all out of sorts today, and I'm the one who caused us to come and do this today. And then I felt like I was late to get to our Zoom call. It's entirely my fault. Like, I'm not trying to blame anyone but me, but I was all out of sorts. I didn't hit record, and I'm used to Call Recorder having my back on this one. And because we switched to Zoom, and because we were all eventually going to be on M1 Max, except maybe John, it wasn't there to save me. It's all my fault, but I feel dumb. Anyway, so you don't want a good edit? You're just going to use the crap copy. That's totally fine. It's entirely my fault. I do not blame you at all, but I'll leave you a nice, intro if you want it.
You'll find out.
Okay.
See, the problem is, if I use the crap copy, it punishes you, but it also punishes me because people will first think that I just suck at audio quality.
Well, you could also leave all this in if you would like.
No, people don't even notice. It'll be short enough. It'll say like, oh, it sounded weird in the beginning, but then it sounded normal. It'll be fine.
I'm going to do this for me, and you're going to ignore it, and that's fine, but it will make me feel slightly better about my ineptitude. So I need you two to shut the hell up for like 10 seconds.
Are you re-recording an intro?
You're never going to be able to do it naturally. It's always going to sound awkward.
No, just let me give it a shot.
We are sponsored this week by Squarespace.
God damn it. All right.
Recording.
Hey, listeners. Would you two shut up for 2 seconds?
That's an incomparable joke for you there, Casey.
Hey, listeners, it's your pal Casey. Some dummy, like me, forgot to hit record right away when I started recording tonight. So if I sound like garbage, it's not Marco's fault. It's not John's fault. It's not your phone's fault. It's my fault. But don't worry, I hit record after a few minutes, and then I'll sound just like I normally do.
I'm not going to use this. I would never put that in. I've already done the edit in my head. I got it covered. Don't worry. I know exactly what I'm going to do. There's no way I'm going to use something like that ever.
You've heard of headcanon? Marco's got head edit.
Yeah.
Hi, listeners. Like this. Why would I ever do that?
Hey, because I just wanted to give you the option. It makes me feel better to know you have the option. I know you're not going to use it. It's not for you. It's for me.
Hey, listeners. Casey here. I'd like to apologize for my ineptitude starting my recording tonight.
He should apologize for his counterfactual statements about cryptocurrency. That's what you should be apologizing for.
Oh, God. Oh.
I hate to tell you, Casey, but you really just don't have any of your facts right on cryptocurrency.
Things you said were based not in fact, but ignorance. Here are 5 paragraphs describing how wrong you are. We're lucky if they have paragraph breaks.
Oh, God. You want to restart the whole friggin' show? Because we can do that.
Nope.
I'm kidding.
We plow bravely forward.
Yep. This is all going in.
I wanted to bring up just a very quick follow-up item from last week's Ask ATP. Somebody had asked about what camera to take to Disney World, and I actually really enjoyed that discussion. I thought it was very interesting. But somebody, Ryan D., wrote in to remind me of Disney PhotoPass. And if you're not a Disney World person, this probably means nothing to you. I'll try to be very brief. Disney PhotoPass is a thing that you can add on, of course, for money, where as you are around the parks, you can choose to have your picture taken by, Disney photographers that have, DSLRs. And I don't recall exactly what equipment they have, but I know they're DSLRs. And as you're around the park, you can say, hey, would you mind taking pictures of us, please? And they'll scan your ticket or your magic band or what have you. And then that evening, that picture will be in your online account. So you can download a full res copy and so on and so forth. I think it was like a couple $100 when we went in late 2019 for Declan's 5th, which on the surface is a lot of money to have, these Disney photographers take your picture. But I absolutely think it's worth every ounce of the money you spend, because not only can you do this, and get everyone in the pictures as opposed to all of our family pictures where it's everyone but me because I'm taking the picture, but also as you get on and off rides, you can just bloop your ticket and it will automatically, send that ride photo that in the before times, it used to cost like $20 for each of these. It'll sync that ride photo with your account and then you can just download it on your own, which is super great. In some cases, in some rides, by some magic I'm not entirely clear on, it'll actually automatically figure out which vehicle you were on and which photo you're in and sync that with your account. You don't have to do any manual blooping of any sort. So that's Disney PhotoPass. If you are a Disney World person or Disneyland, I'm sorry if all you have is Disneyland, but that's neither here nor there. If you're a Disney World person, please check that out. It's very, very good.
Yeah, I think we got that when we went. And if you were like the person last week who was asking what kind of camera should they bring and whether they should use like a rental company to get one, chances are good that you probably also want to take your own photos, because the PhotoPass ones are what you expect. It's you in front of landmarks, taking in a group picture, maybe doing a fun pose, right? But if you're taking your own camera and wanting to get more candid things or casual things or photos of other aspects, traveling to and from the park, your hotel room, kids waiting in line, or all sorts of stuff like that, you want to take your own pictures too. So like everything at Disney, it's an add-on, and it's a good add-on, and you should get it in addition to the other thing, and also the other thing, and also the other thing. So yeah, Disney is expensive, but PhotoPass does have value. Like I said, Casey, I think the only pictures we have with me in them are the PhotoPass pictures.
Exactly.
I'm taking all the pictures, and
Yep.
some of them are good. And then one more note: Casey keeps saying DSLR. I'm assuming they don't have little mirrors flapping up and down in their cameras anymore, but this is just what you're trying to say with that is an interchangeable lens digital camera? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes. A big fancy camera, TM. Moving right along, Dan Chandler had some interesting feedback with regard to cybersecurity and bug bounties and things of that nature. I'm a cybersecurity professional, says Dan Chandler, and have helped run bug bounties for some large organizations. There are a few reasons why an organization should not just pay out for any bug that's reported. First of all, many vulnerabilities reported to bug bounty programs are also sold to criminals. If I'm willing to sell to criminals, then why not get paid twice? Secondly, if you host a bug bounty program that is too quote-unquote generous, then you get more and more people hunting for defects in your product. You have to assume that some percentage of these people are going to sell their exploit to a criminal as well as submit it to the bug bounty program. Since you cannot fix every vulnerability instantly, you want to balance the desire to encourage someone who finds a vulnerability to come forward with the risk to the public of paying random people to hunt for vulnerabilities in your product or service. And then finally, it's actually pretty uncommon for a bug bounty program to uncover a major vulnerability the company did not already know about. It happens, but it's rare. The main purpose of the large bug bounty payouts is essentially to provide hush money to someone who does find a major vulnerability before it is patched.
Yeah, I think that's true in general, but for Apple and the iPhone specifically, there's probably not much more you could do to encourage people to find exploits. It's already people are already highly motivated to do that. So, I mean, it is definitely a bounce, but in general, this definitely makes sense. The getting paid twice thing, I feel like that's just the cost of doing business. I mean, yeah, that's going to happen. You don't have control over it, but all you can do is encourage all the honest people to come, and yeah, the dishonest people are also going to come. It's just the cost of doing business, which is a shame. The hush money thing is interesting because, you see it from my read on these people's blog posts and stuff, the people who are trying to do the right thing and keep quiet for such a long time. And what I feel like is the motivation of these people to eventually break their silence and just essentially refuse the money is not so much that you can pay me to keep quiet, but if you don't, I'm going to out you. Is there is cachet and reputation boost to finding an important vulnerability. You can talk about it at a security conference, right? It helps your profile in the security business to find big vulnerabilities. And the longer you have to keep quiet about them, the more you can't give talks about them, or it's like you don't get reputational credit for it, right? And these are the things I'm reading are people who essentially end up turning down the money from Apple. Now maybe they already sold it to criminals, but I can't tell that from their blog post. But it seems to me that they really just want to tell the world that they found this because they're proud of it. But Apple says, "Oh, you can't until we fix it," and they send an email once every 6 months to say, "No, it's not fixed yet." So that can be frustrating. But anyway, these are all important points in general with bug bounty programs. That especially if you have a thing that people previously weren't breaking into, but suddenly you're giving out millions of dollars, yeah, it's going to attract a bunch of new people to try to find holes in your thing. And your thing does have holes in it because they all do, because they're made by people.
I wanted to briefly talk about cryptocurrency because I really like feedback email, apparently. We got a ton of feedback. We got a ton of feedback about crypto.
Mostly from libertarians, tech pros, and finance bros.
Yes. And we got, to my recollection, maybe I missed it, but to my recollection, we got literally zero email about CSAM, or maybe a couple of items. And boy, did we get a bunch on crypto. So we can tell what ATP listeners care about, or perhaps what they disagree with. But I did want to point out I'm trying to temper myself here. The most compelling argument that I personally have heard in favor of cryptocurrency, which I have not had a lot of time to research, but I did very, very briefly, is that apparently in countries like Nigeria, as an example, Bitcoin may actually be kind of the savior it is claimed to be. My limited understanding, please fact check this if you're interested, because I'm probably lying to you accidentally. My limited understanding is in some of these countries like Nigeria, the what is it, fiat currency? What's the derogatory term they use?
I believe that's it. Yeah, fiat
real
currency.
money.
Yeah.
The fiat currency is like falling apart in a disaster, and so a lot of like regular schmoes in Nigeria, if what I've read is to be believed, are turning to Bitcoin to kind of take banking or take money into their own hands. And if that really is the case, then okay, I can get behind that. That seems somewhat legitimate. I still think there are better ways to go about this, perhaps, but if it costs the heat death of the universe in order to get us there, then YOLO. But I did want to point out that was one of the few semi-compelling arguments I've heard, even though we have heard a lot of arguments about Bitcoin over the last week. Not even like 4 to 5 days since we released.
Would you call them arguments?
A lot of well actuallys.
We've been sent a lot of words about Bitcoin over the last few days. A lot. Like the average length of the emails is quite high.
I don't want to make Casey disappointed, but I think the one thing you picked out as maybe a redeeming value of Bitcoin, I feel like is exactly in keeping with our collective take on it on the last episode. Because the situation you just described is you have people in a country with a failing monetary system, and they can't trust their government to run the monetary system, or the monetary system is badly broken by corruption or massive inflation or all sorts of other problems. Like they don't have a good functioning monetary system. So Bitcoin to the rescue, right? That's exactly the scenario we were describing, where Bitcoin is useful. If you have a bunch of people who can't trust each other and there's no middle party to be the trusted finance institution, like say if you're a criminal or you're trying to collect ransomware or you're living in a failed state and the monetary system of your entire country is falling apart, yeah, Bitcoin is there for you. That's the exact use case. Now, in this case, you're not a criminal or you're not doing anything wrong. It's not your fault you live in this country. And so it's good that there's something. And that's why the underlying technical structure of having a way for people who don't trust each other to nevertheless be able to securely transact without anyone in the middle who they all have to trust. That's why this is interesting. But if the only time it becomes relevant or useful is if it's your last resort, that's not an endorsement of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. That's a condemnation of the monetary system of the country that you live in, right? If Bitcoin was super awesome for being a currency, we would all be using it in this country, because why wouldn't we? But instead we use dollars because they're better for that. And as a sort of, if you have to use Bitcoin specifically for your monetary transactions because you have no choice, your other monetary choices must be really bad, because I would never want to use as my money a thing whose value can be cut in half over the course of a couple of months. It's extremely volatile. It's not, you don't want that in a currency. You don't want it to be that volatile. Maybe if you're using it as an investment vehicle and you're speculating, volatility can be fun and you can make lots of money or lose lots of money, depending on how it goes. But really, if you look at the all-time graph of Bitcoin value, it is extremely spiky. And depending on where you are in the timeline, you could lose half of your money in less than a quarter of a year, and if you're on the other side of the spike. So you could quintuple your money in less than half a year, which is the part that the Bitcoin fans all look at. So if you find yourself in a situation where Bitcoin is your best choice for as a currency, that's a bummer. But I don't think it is an endorsement of Bitcoin as a replacement for quote unquote normal currency.
Fiat.
Yeah.
And there's also, I think there's also the technical barrier is also not to be underestimated. I mean, you have this currency that people are putting real money into and collecting real money from that has a pretty massive technical requirement of knowledge that you need to have and care that you need to take in order to have this very responsibly, if such a thing can be considered responsible on any level. Imagine if people's entire retirement savings were dependent on their password hygiene. This would be a bad scene. That would be really bad. And that's because Bitcoin is so technical, and because it works a lot more like cash under your mattress, but it's cash under your mattress that the entire world can access, and if you make one mistake, the entire world can exploit it. That's not a good place for the general audience of non-technical users to be relying on a lot of their money to be stored in. And so any scenario that you say, oh, Bitcoin's great for this, like, well, there's also, in addition to all the downsides we talked about last week, with the environmental costs and everything, and the the various like illicit trades and ransomware and everything that it seems to have fueled, there's also just this massive technical risk factor here that people get scammed out of their Bitcoins or hacked out of their Bitcoins all the time. And then you involve all these like weird, shady wallet companies and exchanges that introduces its own whole levels of technical risk and opportunities for sleaziness or scams. Like it's like this giant seedy underbelly of finance that the proponents of it seem to be very, hell bent on getting regular people to put their money into it. See also the stock market. Whereas like really, if you don't have a baseline level of knowledge, you will lose, or you will be at risk to lose everything through no fault of your own. And I think that can't be overlooked.
Yeah, a lot of companies build on top of the infrastructure of Bitcoin or whatever. Like you end up going through one of these companies to deal with stuff just because you don't there is a technical barrier to being able to sort of figure out how to do it and having the capacity to do it, right on the network itself. So there's tons of companies that will keep a wallet for you and the mining pools and all sorts of other things where even though Bitcoin is supposed to be decentralized and no central authority or whatever, it doesn't mean that there aren't intermediaries. I imagine most, sort of casual individuals who are doing things with any kind of cryptocurrency are using some kind of intermediary that makes it more convenient for them. Some of them don't actually require you to give up any particular security, in which case you're back to the Marco scenario where, well, it's on you to make sure you're careful with this stuff. But other ones do sort of take over some of the tasks of security for you in exchange for transaction fees or whatever, there are businesses built on top of this. And some people even promoted this as the model that Bitcoin, even though it has a very crappy transaction rate due to proof of work stuff, you can build a second layer on top of that, and that's your currency system and so on and so forth. But, it's a kind of a shame that Bitcoin is the one with all of the PR and everything, because in many ways it's kind of the most primitive and the sort of the least user friendly, let's say. But that said, there are lots of other cryptocurrencies and lots of these other, anyone can make a cryptocurrency and they all have different feature sets and some of them are clones of other ones and there's lots of monetary scams around them. But it's a big world of stuff. Like there are lots of interesting ideas floating around there, from like Ethereum's like contracts on the blockchain and everything to all sorts of, the proof of work versus proof of stake for stuff and all the various parameters within those models and how they're distributed. And it's sort of like a bunch of experiments all being run at once. Which one of these works? Which is easiest to scam? Which makes the most money for investors? Which has the highest chance of you losing all your money because you forgot your password or got hacked and got your, private key stolen? Like that's all happening out there. And I think some, the underlying technology, you can't put this genie back in the bottle. Like this is technology that has a use, even if it ends up mostly being used to like stop cheaters in online games or something in the future, like decades from now. Something is going to come of this. But right now, it is a fairly dangerous place for individuals to be. So we, when we come down hard on crypto, it's not like we're saying, oh, nothing will ever come of this. This technology is bad and should be, erased. No, the technology, the knowledge, the math, the experimentation, that's all great. But if you're an individual listening to a tech podcast and you're like, should I put all my money into cryptocurrency? Should I put any money into cryptocurrency? You kind of have to know what you're getting into. It's super risky. Very dangerous. You have to know a lot about what you're doing. And there are a lot of people out there who are going to encourage you with all of their might to put as much as possible into whatever their pet cryptocurrency is because they stand to gain from it. So kind of like the stock market, like Marco said, there are people who will encourage you, become a day trader, get on E-Trade, do individual investing. And that's just a losing bet. Not because the stock market is inherently a bad thing that we should eliminate, although maybe there's a different argument for that elsewhere. But because as an individual, if you are going to try to be an individual investor and speculate on what's going to go up and what's going to go down, you're probably going to lose. So maybe don't do that. Like that's why you see the sort of boring financial advice of, even though it's fun to be a day trader and maybe you can do it as a hobby, don't bet your life savings on it, right? Cryptocurrency is very similar. I'm always very wary of people really pushing that everyone should be getting into Bitcoin coming from somebody who has a big stake in Bitcoin, or it's their hobby, or it's not always nefarious. Sometimes they're just enthusiastic. Like they're super into it, right? Some people are super into something. They really want you to get into it and they will encourage you. it's not like they're trying to scam you, and they're may not even be doing it to think, well, if more people get into Bitcoin, the value will go up and my money will go up. They're just really enthusiastic about it, but it still doesn't mean, like, people enthusiastic about day trading too. It still doesn't mean that it's right for you. So in general, I would say cryptocurrency, like, you'll know it when it becomes a thing that is reasonable and safe for people to do. But right now we are still definitely in the lots of experiments going on phase. So NFTs out there, you got Ethereum, you got Bitcoin. We don't know how this is going to all work out, and lots of signs point to it not working out really well at all. So the safe bet is to just stay away. If you want to throw a couple bucks in and play with it, and you can deal with the potential moral implications of a tiny increase in CO2 output from your tiny individual contribution, go for it. But don't buy the hype that it is any one of these things is necessarily the future of currency, because that is, to say the least, a huge open question.
We are sponsored this week by Squarespace. Start building your new website today at squarespace.com/ATP. Enter offer code ATP at checkout to get 10% off. Make your next move with a beautiful website from Squarespace. Squarespace, quite simply, makes it incredibly easy to make great websites. It takes almost no time, and you don't need to be a web developer or a designer or a nerd in order to make it. There's no coding required. So this has amazing potential. You know, as nerds like me, even if you could make a website yourself in some manual way, Squarespace can be a massive time saver, especially if you want to do something complicated that, normally for your, hosting it yourself, things like storefronts or podcast hosting, or really any kind of dynamic functionality, galleries, calendar, stuff like that. It's tricky to do all that stuff yourself. Or you create work for yourself in the future if you do it. Like, you have to set up a server somewhere. You have to do software upgrades. You got to worry about server maintenance and uptime and, security patches and stuff like that. Squarespace takes all of that away. So even if you are a nerd, that's a huge time saver, and it reduces your own future liability and work. And if you're not a nerd, you can create websites that are just as good as what professionals can make, even if you don't have any design or development or web development skills. So it's amazing. See for yourself by starting a free trial at squarespace.com/ATP. There's no credit card required. You can build the entire site in trial mode and see how it works for you and if it works for you. And once you're ready to sign up, go back there, squarespace.com/ATP. Use offer code ATP to get 10% off your first purchase. That's squarespace.com/ATP, code ATP for 10% off your first purchase. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring our show. Make your next move at Squarespace.
PhotoPass stuff. This is child safety stuff. We talked about quite a bit last week, which I actually really enjoyed the conversation. We got a lot of very positive feedback about it, which I really genuinely appreciate. That was very kind of all of you. We do have some feedback about it, follow-up about it, though. Facebook found 20 million photos, not 20 million people. That is quite a big difference. I'm not sure which one of us said that incorrectly, but it is worth noting.
Yeah, we said it right a whole bunch of times, but I think I eventually said it wrong once. So just to make that clear, in case you're afraid that there are 20 million child predators out there now. But if you want to get depressed, you can start trying to do the math and figure out, well, so how many pictures per person is it, and how many people is it? I don't know that math. All I know is it was 20 million photos, and that was in 1 year. So maybe it doesn't make you feel as good. But anyway.
Yikes. Moving right along. John, you found a very entrancing PDF that you'd like to share with the class?
Yeah, I'm going to reference this in the next item, but these are all on apple.com/child-safety. This one was called, Security Threat Model Review, Apple's Child Safety Features. I thought it was interesting because if you read it, each thing that is part of the system that we described last week is broken into sections where it says, what are the goals of this feature, what are the design principles, and what are the security and privacy requirements. And if you read this document in isolation, it makes a lot of sense. Like, it's like, okay, here's this feature. Here's the principles we had. Like, what the principles are, how is it vulnerable? Should Apple be able to do this or not be able to do it? Should information never leave the user's device or stay on the device? Like, the security and privacy requirements. Like, it's saying when implementing this feature, here are the things we want to be true about it. And if you list it, you'll be nodding your head and going, yeah, that's a good goal of this feature. I like those design principles. I like the security and privacy requirements. And it explains why is the system made the way it is. And it also explains why, in this interview with Craig Federighi from Joanna Stern of the Wall Street Journal, that Federighi really hammers on the superior privacy of Apple's approach. It's almost like he's reading from this document of saying, we did it this way because this provides more privacy. And he doesn't elaborate on it. This document elaborates on it. When he says more privacy, this is what he means. The things in this document are saying it has these qualities. It adheres to these principles. The goals of this features were X, Y, and Z, and that's why we did it this way to achieve these goals. So I'm going to get back to that in a second, but I'll let Casey summarize the interview.
Right. So this is, the interview with Craig Federighi and Joanna Stern, which I just wanted to say, I think Joanna is excellent. She did such a great job at this. There are some quibbles that I think we have, but by and large, I thought it was really, really well done. And I liked the way that she would like pause Federighi and they would do, their little motion graphics or illustrations, whatever they are, in order to explain stuff. There were a couple of interesting points about this, though. I love Federighi. I really do. I think he strikes me as a very nice and very smart guy. I didn't love this interview with him, though. It seemed, I got the vibe that he wasn't telling me the whole story, even though allegedly he was trying to tell the whole story. And granted, it's a short interview. Granted, it's for a more basic audience. But I don't know. Some of the things he said just didn't rub me right. One of the things he did say, though, is that the database of hashes, I guess, are shipped on device, which we'd known last week. And he specifically cited that it's the same database in China as it is in America, which I thought it was interesting that he kind of gave a nod in the direction of China as something that we're all, not fearful of, but I can't think of a better way of phrasing it. And it makes sense. I mean, that is what we're all thinking about, but I was surprised that he acknowledged it. And then the other thing that struck me a little weird was he said there are multiple levels of auditability in this system. Like there are multiple places where regular people can audit it. And he implied, for example, that regular people could audit the contents of the database that is shipped as part of iOS. And I just, where is this? Because I don't see this. And maybe it's to be announced, like how a regular person or perhaps a security researcher could go in and look at this.
Did he say regular people? Because my impression
No, he didn't. He didn't.
He means people outside Apple.
Yes, exactly. But even still, like a me or a you or a Marco or like a Guy Rambo, like where is this stuff that we can go look at? Because Apple generally doesn't take too kindly to us, opening up iOS releases and trying to go spelunking within them. So perhaps I'm being Chicken Little, and perhaps there'll be explicit instructions about it, even for regular people, for all I know. But sitting here today, it seemed a little dubious to me.
Well, I mean, they're going to ship the bits to you, so and if it's in the OS, people will be able to find it and compare it and know when it changes and see that it is the same across regions and all this other stuff, right? And there's a lot more technical detail that I felt like in this interview, he was trying to. He couldn't possibly go into the stuff that these tech documents go into. Not even the stuff from the threat model document that I put in the links, but everything he was saying in them, you could sort of reference back to that. But there was one question that Joanna didn't ask. That I think would have been illuminating, and really is the thing that I've been thinking about since our discussion last week. That it's it's not a problem for Apple now, but I feel like it makes everything they say and people's discomfort with it makes more sense when you look in on this one point and this question. We talked about it last week too, but I'm going to dive into it again here. Joanna didn't ask about end-to-end encryption on iCloud backups and iCloud Photo Library, right? Doesn't currently exist, right? Right now, when you do an iCloud backup, Apple has the key to it. It's encrypted at rest, but Apple has the key so they can look at it. Same thing with your iCloud Photo Library. If Apple wanted, they can look at all your pictures because they're on Apple servers. And yes, they're all encrypted, but Apple has the key, right? That's my understanding. And I've checked that in a couple different places, and that's the case, right? Everything in this threat model document is true within the scope of the features they added. Like, here was our design requirements. We didn't want Apple to be able to see any of your pictures until you've crossed the threshold. And, we didn't want to know if you were near the threshold, with all and by the way, something I got wrong on the thing. They sent a security voucher for every single picture. So even, the good ones and the bad ones. So Apple has no idea. Like, every single picture gets a security voucher that they scan. Apple has no idea whether of all the security vouchers they got are a few of them indicating a bad picture is past the threshold or whatever, right? So these are the design principles. Like, Apple's like, we didn't want to know this. We wanted to make it secure, so we can't tell this. Mathematically, we can't do this. And it's like, okay, the feature you described fulfills these requirements, but there's a huge problem. None of that matters because you don't need to mess with this at all, Apple, because you have access to all our pictures. You don't have to worry. This CSAM feature doesn't change the fact that you already have access to all our pictures. Like, every one of the sort of design goals and security and privacy requirements in these CSAM features is pointless because, as I was trying to make the point last week, no one would ever try to use this system to get at the pictures because there's already complete access to every single person's picture on the server side today. That's the way it is, right? So when reading this document and them saying this is better privacy, the only way it makes sense to me is that eventually, if Apple does end-to-end encryption of iCloud backups or even just photos things or whatever, suddenly this all makes sense. Because suddenly these security requirements and design principles are relevant, right? It's like saying, boy, this door has 1 million locks on it and even Apple can't open it, but there's no wall. And so you can just walk past the door. But the door is super secure. The door it really preserves your privacy. But it's like, but there's no wall. It's like, but we'll only try to go. It doesn't make any sense, right? And so what I get out of this whole week's worth of press and everything is that seems like Apple does not want to be able to see your photos, but they currently can. Every part of the CSAM system and the scanning thing or whatever is made so that Apple's like, look, we don't want to see your photos. We don't want to be able to see your photos. Like, not until this threshold, like that's why they built this complicated system of like, we have the system that's going to try to see if it's a match against this database, but it's not exact. So we have to do a threshold. And when it hits, only then do we ever want to even be able to see a low resolution thumbnail to try to confirm if it's one of the pictures from the NICMEC database. But otherwise, we don't want to be able to see your photos at all, but we totally can. We can see all of them. Right. And so, and they haven't said anything about this. Like, I mean, if you had asked them, hey, Apple, are you ever going to do end-to-end encryption on iCloud Photo Library and iCloud backups? They're not going to tell you because they don't talk about future products. But this entire feature only makes sense in a world where Apple plans to do that. Here's the second problem. Everything I said last week about don't worry about this feature because it doesn't make security any worse because Apple already has access to all of your photos. If that ever changes and Apple suddenly doesn't have access to all your photos, this CSAM feature does become the most attractive vector for governments or anyone else to force Apple to get its stuff, right? What I was trying to say last week, which a lot of people weren't understanding, is like, no one would go through the CSAM feature to do this. There's way easier ways, right? Why would you make your life more difficult? The system is way more secure than the, hey, Apple, just, decrypt everything and let us scan it, or like hacking Apple to do that or whatever, right? But if that changes, then what everyone's saying about, oh, you built the feature, now it's easy to get it, that suddenly becomes true because the previous lack of a wall, now there's a brick wall there. And the door suddenly becomes the most viable vector because at least it opens and closes and you just have to pick the locks or whatever, right? So it's kind of a weird situation. Like, and I haven't seen this really put in these terms in any of the discussion. It's like some of these features are nonsensical now, but if you make them make sense by implementing end-to-end encryption, all of the sort of scare tactics about the slippery slope things become worse because then this does become the most valid way to try to have a government force Apple to do things. And as I was trying to emphasize last week, governments can force you to do things because that's the way government works. They have all the guns and they control the laws in the countries in which they operate. And if you don't like that, you can't, there's no amount of security that can fix that. Like, governments can outlaw end-to-end security and then it'll become illegal for you to do that and they can make it criminal and take you to court and blah, blah, blah. You really need to deal with your government. That is your core problem here. But since we don't know, okay, does Apple plan to implement end-to-end security? It's hard to know how to feel about these features. If the Apple has said, and by the way, we're going to do end-to-end security, if they announced that at the same time of this, I would be much more on the side of, the CSAM feature, now that they've built it, it makes it more likely that bad things will happen. But they didn't announce that. So we have no idea if they're ever going to do end-to-end encryption. So it's really weird. And that's why I think this threat model document is great. If you read it and don't know about all the other aspects of Apple's security on their servers, like the fact that the iCloud backups are not end-to-end encrypted and Apple already has access to your photos, then this document in isolation looks airtight. But if you do know that context, this document starts to seem really weird and nonsensical. And by the way, if I'm wrong about the photos thing, again, I tried to confirm that with as many people as I could think to ask this question to, and everyone said, yes, this is the truth. But if that's not the case, someone from Apple, please tell me. Can Apple currently look at all the iCloud, photos in someone's, in theory, not that they do, I'm sure they don't, but in theory, could they look at everyone's photos in their iCloud photo library. As far as I've been able to tell, the answer to that is yes. We know it's true for iCloud backups because they've done that, and law enforcement and stuff has made them do that in the U.S. or whatever. So.
Well, and I think that's a critical differentiator. A lot of people here are assuming, like you are, proposing, like many people have proposed, like, well, this seems like an obvious precursor to Apple offering end-to-end iCloud encryption. And that's actually that's probably a separate discussion of like whether that's even a good idea, and certainly whether that should be the default or whether it should be an opt-in thing, because there are serious repercussions if, for example, you forget your password and you lose access to all your devices, and like that's kind of like that's a big support issue just from the reality of customer support and everything that Apple have to deal with. But
yeah, we talked about this on past episodes of ATP. Of the reason Apple is resisting doing that is not so much because it's a principled stand against or like they want to be able to access your things. It's a customer support issue, which I kind of believe. But as time marches on, I think as we said last time we discussed, as time marches on, it becomes less and less tenable to say, okay, customer support, and I think some support for the idea that Apple's coming around on this is the new features they added about like delegating to like a family member to unlock your stuff, whatever that feature is
right,
called.
Yeah, the legacy planning stuff.
Right. That is a thing that someone would do if they were eventually planning to really bite the bullet and say, I know it's going to be a pain in the ass for customer support, but like I would imagine they would really start pushing hard on when everybody sets up your phone, like, please tell us. Are you sure you don't want to tell us somebody like your brother or sister or parent or a friend who you want to trust? Because you're going to need this later when you forget your passwords, right? If they hammer that feature really hard, then maybe they can mitigate against the eventual end-to-end encryption.
Yeah, but I think ultimately, I would bet that this feature's existence, while this would, I think, make end-to-end encryption easier for the law and governments to swallow if it does eventually become either an option or the default. I don't know that this necessarily suggests that that's coming, because you're right that I'm pretty sure Apple does have the keys to all of your iCloud data, with the exception of iCloud Keychain, which is end-to-end encrypted. But as far as I can guess, it seems like maybe they wouldn't want whatever the process is that they use internally to make sure that random employees aren't just snooping on everyone's iCloud data. Like, I'm sure they probably have some kind of process for actually decrypting customer data and handing it over to law enforcement. And they might only want to invoke that when served with the warrant, for instance. Whereas the CSAM scanning feature, this is the difference between law enforcement versus surveillance. This feature is constantly scanning your stuff going up to iCloud, even if no warrant has been issued against you. And so maybe they don't want that same, whatever the warrant reply system is, where, okay, we're served with this warrant, we are forced, we legally must comply with it, so we are forced to hand over any data we have about this customer, so then they have a process to deal with that, right? But what if they use that process to look into your photos and then hand it off to the police? Maybe they could get sued for, I don't know, maybe suppose they refer somebody to law enforcement, and it ends up it's actually like a false positive. It's actually the stuff they have is actually legal, and they get law enforcement on their backs, and it ruins their life, and then they sue Apple. Maybe Apple just wants to keep their hands as clean as possible, and okay, well, the keys that we have to look at all your iCloud data, we're only going to use those keys as we are legally required to when served with a warrant or subpoena or whatever. Whereas this automated system that's proactively surveilling all of our data for this stuff, maybe that goes through a much more strict and narrow view process to avoid their own liability.
I think it's kind of the opposite, where if they're served a warrant, that the information they get from that will be admissible in court, whereas it's questionable whether the surveillance stuff that they catch, just by scanning everybody is. But in terms of the government making them do things, even just the plain old U.S. government can not just make Apple say, oh, we'll scan this person's thing. They can, because terrorism, I'm sure, make Apple, under the right conditions, have a secret warrant that requires Apple to scan everybody's picture all the time, 24 hours a day, in perpetuity, for whatever the government wants them to, because terrorism, and because of some terrible Patriot Act law and a secret judge that offers a secret thing. And by the way, Apple can't talk about it. Maybe they're already doing this, right? Setting aside the NSA hacking them and already being inside their data centers, or, having cracked all the encryption and gotten the secret keys out for everyone's, there's so many scenarios in which the U.S. government has done things that are no worse than what I just described for very stupid reasons. And so that's why when I read all these documents, it's like what I keep hearing in my head and what I hear in the Federighi thing is Apple doesn't want to be able to see your photos. Like they don't even want to be able to do it. It's kind of like the reason they were able to resist the FBI thing is there's literally nothing they can do, right? Right now, Apple is able, yes, there are policies and processes involved, but they're able to see your photos. And it's much easier for Apple to say, we literally can't do that. We don't have the keys. That's where Apple wants to be. That's how these CSAM features have been designed, but that is not how iCloud Backups and iCloud Photo Library are designed. And so those two features are not in keeping with everything that Apple is doing and saying about, like they would prefer not to. And the CSAM thing is like, again, with the potential of end-to-end in the future, if these EU and UK laws come down that requires Apple to scan, now they can still do that with end-to-end encryption. Like it doesn't prevent them from doing end-to-end encryption on the iCloud Photo Library. Like they're now well positioned to comply with all laws, but also no longer be able to see things on their servers, which will then, like I said, make the CSAM feature much more dangerous. So it's a weird situation they're in, and Apple's, some other people said this on other podcasts I listened to, that like Apple's secrecy about this means that we don't hear anything and all of a sudden it just arrives and it's like, oh, what's all this stuff? And they announced everything all together. And their secrecy also means that they're not going to tell us that this is a precursor to doing end-to-end encryption. So we just had to guess. And so we don't really know quite how to feel about it. So it's weird and complicated. And I think Apple's actual security, like threat model of, their entire company is very different than what they're doing more recently. And the things they're doing more recently lean in one direction very strongly, but the things they've done in the past are variable, to say the least.
Yeah, it's a mess. Like, I don't need to rehash everything we talked about last week, but they're kind of darned if they do, darned if they don't. And I think in a lot of ways they've kind of set themselves up in this position because of secrecy, because of, we're the most private of all the people or all the companies. And so it's tough.
I mean, can you blame? Like, they knew this was going to be a problem. That's why they announced it on late in the weekend in August. Like, it's this is when you drop news that might be unpopular. Is you drop it Thursday or Friday in August.
Like it's hot.
I don't think they had that much to worry about, because I think most of the people flipping out about this are people who are like tech nerds or into the security world. But like in terms of a story that has legs with the general public, I mean, there's the possibility that it sort of latches on as like Apple's always scanning your phone, but even those things, like the whole Facebook is listening on your microphone or whatever, I think people lose interest in those. Maybe they're just not juicy enough. This is the problem with lots of tech security related stuff, for good and for bad. When something really bad happens, it's very difficult to get regular people to care about it because it just seems so weird and esoteric, and you have to convince them of these fourth order effects that may affect them. And it's why we get so many bad laws. I mean, remember how much we fought against the DMCA and everything and all of the bad things that could cause? And now if there's 3 milliseconds of music from a passing car in your YouTube video, one strike is against you, and soon your livelihood's going to be gone if it happens 3 times, right? Like, the consequences happened, still no one cares. It's like, that's just the way the thing is. No copyright intended. It's like, it's hard to get people to care. It's hard to get people to care about these issues. And so Apple, in this case, I feel like Apple is going to benefit from that apathy of the general public.
We are sponsored this week by Mack Weldon, the brand that has reinvented men's basics. They got famous because of their underwear. Their underwear is fantastic. I wear it literally every day. And they are so much more than underwear now. They have a huge collection of amazing men's basics. T-shirts, polos, button-ups, shorts, pants, swimsuits, and so much more. What I like about them, I wear Mack Weldon. Every day I'm wearing their underwear, no matter what, because it's literally 100% of my underwear. So every day I'm wearing Mack Weldon underwear. I know you really want to know this, right? I also have many of their socks. I have tons of their T-shirts. I especially love their silver line of T-shirts. I wear these all summer long and much of the winter because silver fibers in the fabric blend actually are antimicrobial and makes it basically impossible to stink while wearing it. Also, if you want, different materials for workout clothes, they're great at all of that. They have all sorts of, breathable mesh fabrics and stuff like that. As the summer comes to a close and we get into the fall, I love their long sleeve collection. It is fantastic. My favorite is the warm knit series of long sleeve shirts, and they have all sorts of other options from there, tech cashmere, all sorts of great stuff. So they have amazing materials, amazing products. I love the fit of their clothes. It's modern, but it's also comfortable. It's not like, too skin tight or anything. So it's comfortable, it's consistent, easy to buy, easy to wear, easy to care for, and it lasts forever. I've had Mack Weldon clothes now for something like 4 or 5 years. I don't think I've ever lost a single item of clothing to like just wearing out. Their stuff is just fantastic. So see for yourself at mackweldon.com/ATP podcast, and you can get 20% off your first order with promo code ATP podcast. Once again, that's mackweldon.com, MackWeldon, mackweldon.com/ATP podcast. Promo code ATP podcast for 20% off. I love Mack Weldon's clothes. I wear them all the time. mackweldon.com/ATP podcast. Thank you so much to Mack Weldon for sponsoring our show. Mack Weldon, reinventing men's basics.
Speaking of benefiting from apathy from the general public, what do you guys think about Electron?
Oh man, I'm so happy we finally got to this. It was pressing on us because it had just happened like right before we recorded last week, but we were not going to have room for it in the show with all the CSAM stuff last week. So here we go.
Yeah, all right. So for my own benefit, I would like to issue a quick series of disclosures. First of all, 1Password has sponsored the show in the past, most recently on the 8th of June, which was episode 434. You probably won't believe it based on this conversation we're about to have, but they have sponsored us in the past.
Well, and to be clear, they sponsored us one time. There are currently no future sponsorships booked with them. Although I don't think we would turn them down because I still use 1Password and like them as a company. And we are, I think, about to criticize them. And I think this should tell you listeners that we are not afraid to criticize sponsors. And I hope you trust us on that because we're going to just, let it rip here. And, I think we will be civil to them because I think that's just our style most of the time. But we will criticize them freely. So here we go.
You're not going to suggest that their CEO be fired? We only do that to Apple.
Yeah, only Apple. Only Apple. That's funny. No, but I do want to also note that the 1Password people that I've spoken to, and I don't know any of them terribly well, but any of the ones that I've spoken to have been incredibly, impossibly nice people because, hey, guess what? A lot of them are Canadian, so that stands. But they are very, very nice. I do think they are well-meaning, but don't like the decisions of late, I got to tell you, gentlemen. So this morning, I downloaded 1Password 8 beta for Mac OS, which is now being written or has been written in Electron. Electron, again, is the cross-platform app framework that lets you allegedly, ostensibly write once, run anywhere. It is based on web technologies. And so in my personal estimation, it's write once, feel not native everywhere. So it does kind of work everywhere, but it doesn't feel native anywhere. And there's probably 350 different takes we can have on this or different approaches on this. But I think the thing that really bums me out that I'd like to say up front is there's a list of software. There's not a long list, but a list of software that I feel like I evangelize because I love it. I really, really love the software. And hand to God, 1Password has always been on that list. And this list for me anyway is very, very short. 1Password so far has been pretty much bulletproof for me. I personally really like their subscription service. I know a lot of people are deeply turned off by it, and that's fine. I can totally understand why you would feel that way. But for me, I jumped on 1Password for families early, and it has become absolutely critical for Aaron and I to share important passwords and also documents between each other in a way that's secure and safe. And I have always held their apps, their entire Apple app suite. I can't speak for Windows or Linux, but
I can.
Or for Android either, but apparently Marco can either confirm what I'm about to say or deny it. But at least on Apple platforms, their apps have always been excellent platform citizens. By that I mean, whatever the convention of the particular platform we're talking about, whatever the convention is on iOS, whatever the convention is on Mac OS, perhaps Marco on Windows, or maybe Android, they've always treated that platform well, and they've always acted as a good citizen within the platform. When in Rome, do what the Romans do. Well, they've always done that very well, irrespective of platform. Is that true on Windows too?
I've used 1Password on Windows for a total of like 20 minutes, but and I've used Windows, outside of a game, I've used Windows for not that much more than that in the last decade or more. So I can't really say how good of a Windows app it is compared to other Windows apps. But I can say that as a 1Password user for many years, as a 1Password family plan user, again, I think I mentioned this all during the ad, and certainly we've talked about them occasionally here and there before. We have it for my family. We like it. It works well. For the most part, I have a few asterisks on that, but for the most part, it works well. It has worked well. One of the great things about it that is, that I think is a major advantage it has over Apple's, iCloud Keychain stuff that's been increasing in scope over the last few years, is that I can use it on Windows. And this is not even that new. I mean, for a while they would have like this like JavaScript web app you could export and have that work, on Windows or anything else. They at some point in the last few years, I believe they started offering the actual like native Windows client. I haven't used it on Linux. Sorry, I mean, who has? But next year is the year.
Next year, damn it.
But the cross-platform nature, like being able, like when I was setting up a gaming PC, being able to have all my passwords in there for, all of the stupid Microsoft accounts and Dropbox and everything, it was really nice. It's a very convenient thing to have that available cross-platform. So I very much value 1Password, and I think what we're about to get into here is their new beta for their new stuff, and it really suggests that the client experience of 1Password is about to get worse. And that makes me sad because I've had, for the most part, only very good things to say about it. I mean, the only problems I've really had with it in the last maybe year or so, I've found the browser plugin to be less reliable at various things. But otherwise, it's been great for years before that. And the fact that it's about to get worse in certain ways, it seems like a really unfortunate thing and possibly an avoidable thing.
Yeah, and real-time follow-up. As of just a few hours ago, Apple released iCloud for Windows 12.5, which apparently includes a password manager app. So
really? They don't have one on the Mac?
Well,
unless you count keychain access, which is terrible.
Oh, come on. Keychain's the best.
In Monterey, they moved it into system preferences, so there's a preference pane for passwords.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's a little better.
Yeah, it is. That's probably kind of where you'd expect to see it. Keychain access is more like a utilities folder kind of thing. But like if you just, like normal people don't use keychain access, but I feel like normal people will go to system preferences and click on the thing that says passwords. And that's the exposure to the new password thing has like a 2-factor thing built in and will generate your passwords. And it's also, by the way, reflected in Safari in Monterey. So like Safari has it in its own preferences, like also decked out with the new features, but they also put it in system preferences because that's where people will look for it. So things are getting better and slightly more featureful on the Mac. Still nowhere close to 1Password's features. You haven't even mentioned the family thing, which I think is the real killer feature of 1Password, even if you never do anything cross-platform.
Narrator, they both mentioned it.
Okay. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, no, that's the thing is that for me, what I love about 1Password is, as compared to like iCloud Keychain, is that first of all, I can store things other than passwords, and maybe you can in iCloud Keychain, but last I had looked at it, that wasn't the case. I can store documents, I can store notes, I can store things that aren't just passwords, which for me is very important.
You can store notes. I haven't tried documents, but you can just make notes in Keychain access, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, well, I also keep like PDFs, for example, and things like that in there.
Yeah, I keep like a scan of my driver's license.
Exactly,
it's like things. It's handy to have this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And again, as both Marco and I were evangelizing and touting 1Password for families, or when I last had a real job, I brought 1Password to our company, and we were using 1Password for business at the same time I was using 1Password for families, and all of that intermingled really, really well, actually. So again, I love 1Password the service. I personally love paying for 1Password the service. I mean that genuinely, because not only are the people very good in the apps, until maybe now, really good, but the service is really good. And it genuinely makes my online life better and more secure. And for that, I think it's well worth whatever money it is I pay them every year. But yeah, this new beta Mac app is based on Electron. And again, that means it's written in JavaScript and apparently a whole bunch of Rust. They're very excited about Rust over there. And what that means is, in my personal opinion, it will never feel properly and truly native. Now, can you get close? You certainly can. But for me, the canonical good Electron app is Visual Studio Code. And Visual Studio Code, to me, is a genuinely and truly great app. Native, though, not really. it's a great app, but it doesn't really feel native. It doesn't really feel like it's part of the Mac. And that's okay. But what bums me out about 1Password is they have this long, like 15 or 20 year history of being excellent platform systems everywhere. Excellent platform citizens, everywhere. And this certainly doesn't smell like it's going to be the case too much longer. And I have installed the beta, and I've used it for a little while. And as the three of us do, I have thoughts. Do you want me to start diving into this, or would we rather kind of talk about, Penny is not on airplane mode right now. Would you rather, let me just reboot that whole thing. Would you like to have me go into my particulars, or would you rather talk kind of more generally before we get into that?
I think you should go through your list of complaints, because I think it's important that you made this list, because lots of people will say this, it uses web technologies and it doesn't feel native on the Mac or whatever. But like, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean in concrete terms? How does it affect me as the user? What if I'm not a touchy-feely person who has this inherent feel of, if I can feel this isn't right for the Mac? Like, what are the actual consequences? And I think that's what you have a list of here. We say that all the time, but I think it's important to nail it down. So please do.
Yeah. So I went on a Twitter rant about this, which I directed at the 1Password account. So if you happen to follow me but don't follow 1Password, you wouldn't have seen it. I'll put an unrolled version of it linked in the show notes. But nevertheless, so here's some examples. When I installed the beta, one of the first things it asked me on my iMac Pro, on my Intel iMac Pro, was, hey, do you want to use Touch ID? What? I'm sorry, on my Intel iMac Pro? Yes, I would like to use Touch ID, but I can't. I can't. And that is a very silly thing that lasted 2.5 seconds. But it's the sort of thing that if it were a native app, and perhaps there is a way with this new based on Electron app, maybe, or powered by Electron or whatever, maybe there's a way to get to the API that would tell them whether or not Touch ID is even available on this particular computer. But based on my experience, they certainly didn't bother trying to figure that out. And so this is a great example of like least common denominator user interface. One of the platforms that this app may run on has Touch ID. So screw it. Let's ask everyone about Touch ID, which is fine. Like, is it in and of itself a big deal? Certainly not. But that's my first paper cut, and I've been running this new app for 30 seconds. Okay, so let's say I go and I try to enter my master password. So I'm sorry, I should have said this already, but basically if you've somehow lived under a rock and aren't familiar with 1Password, you have one password. You have a single password that opens
figured
up.
It out. You cracked it.
Maybe that's why he became a dentist.
So you have this one password that once you open it up, then you have unique passwords for like everything under the sun. You have a unique password for Gmail, unique password for Facebook, and so on and so forth. So when you enter that one password incorrectly, in every version of 1Password I've ever used, or every native version, I don't recall if it did it on the web or not, but in every native version though, the screen would shake side to side, just like the login screen does on a Mac. And at one point I entered my password incorrectly, either on purpose or by accident, and nothing happened. It just said, oh, that's not right. Is that a big deal? Certainly not. But I've been using 1Password, 10, 15, probably like 10 years. And I'm used to seeing a shake when I get the password wrong. I'm not even really looking at the screen, but I'm seeing something shaking side to side in my periphery. And I know, I got to try that again. Again, something silly, something that maybe could be done, but at least as of the time in which we are recording, is not being done.
And to be fair, it is a beta.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think a lot of this stuff, ultimately, I think a lot of this stuff is probably not going to improve for the final version.
And that's the thing is, if the ostensible reason for going to this Electron-powered monstrosity is to have as little custom user interface on any given platform as you can get away with, then why would they make it shake? Unless they make it shake everywhere. And gosh knows that the animation APIs are going to be different on a Mac versus Windows and so on and so forth. So I don't think things like this are going to change. And I'd love to be wrong. Golly, I would love more than almost anything in the world, even more than eating crow about crypto, which I'm never going to do because I'm right. I would love to be able to eat crow on this and say, you know what, this new Electron version, the final released version, hand to God, I can't tell the difference between this and the real one, and the native one, the real one. See what I did there? And the native one. So yeah, I was wrong. It's just fine.
By the way, the animation APIs would be the same on all platforms because they'd be web APIs. That's the whole point of a web-based.
Oh, that's true. No, you're right. You're right.
It's just CSS animation. But like what you're getting at is the conventions. Like, did it always shake on Windows, or was that just a Mac thing? Right? Is that a convention on Windows like it is in the Mac, shaking when you get it wrong, or is it not a convention? So if you did it everywhere, you may not, like you said before, may not feel like a native citizen of the platform, like that you're not complying with the conventions of your environment, but instead are complying with the conventions that someone has decided should be the same across all platforms.
Right. So then things got dodgy. And I think I've since figured out what the problem is. I suspect, and I hope that this will get fixed by the time the beta is no longer a beta. But when I first started trying to use this new 1Password 8 beta, it had me install a new version of the extension for Safari, which makes perfect sense. It's totally reasonable. But it didn't seem like it really wanted to do anything. But there was no solid communication between Safari and the actual app. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. But, I would go to hit the little icon in the toolbar in Safari, which in the past would ask me to enter my password right there in the extension, which I believe is not the case anymore. I think I was running an old extension or something like that. I'm a little wishy-washy on this, so I might be lying. But one way or another, the extension that I was used to was that it would let me enter the password right there in the extension, and then it would give me my list of passwords, for that particular website. Well, now it's kicking open the full app, which is kind of annoying because it's a context switch I'm not expecting and don't particularly want, but okay, fine. But then when I would successfully enter my password, the extension would just sit there and spin. Okay, so I tried it again. Same story. Eventually, I figured out what appears to be the problem was I made the critical mistake of asking 1Password not to be in my menu bar on my Mac, which is something I've done forever. I really don't like menu bar items except the ones I want up there, which is funny because I have like 304 up there, but they're the ones I want, darn it. And so
I'm so with you on this, by the way. I'm 1,000% with you on that.
Right, thank you. And so I hate having things that I don't want on my menu bar. And yes, I'm aware that Bartender exists. I don't want to use Bartender. I just want to have the stuff I want up there. And so immediately when I had installed the beta, I took I had checked unchecked, I guess I should say, the option of having 1Password in the menu bar. And kudos to them that option was already there in the beta. Everything was great. Except it appears that by taking it out of the menu bar, I have also killed the daemon, for lack of a better term, the always resident server, if you will, that's within my Mac in order to communicate with 1Password. So when Safari was going to talk to the daemon, it wasn't there.
It's pronounced affluent.
Did I? Oh, God. I don't even know what I just said that made you think of that. But anyways, the point is that I was trying to get to this process that wasn't there, and so it wasn't working. And then once I finally figured out, I wonder if I need to keep 1Password in the menu. Oh, okay, great. So apparently I do need to have the menu bar icon there, which I really, really don't want. And again, I would hope and suspect that this will get fixed in the future, but if this is the way it is forever, I'm going to be real grumpy about it. It's a dumb thing to be grumpy about, but darn it, I'm going to be grumpy about it.
This is not. No, I mean, first of all, it's probably just a beta bug. But second of all,
I agree.
If that were actually how it would ship, I would be grumpy about that too, because and this is, I think, part of the larger picture here, but I hate when I install something that is, to me, a utility, and it wants to take over my computer.
Yep.
And it's like, hey, you know what? Did you know we now do all of these other things? Now you can use, Dropbox as the biggest example of this in recent years. But it's like, Now you can use us for all your collaboration and tool. And it's like, no, I don't want. You are a utility, not my entire computer. My computer is not yours. And when applications that have no good reason to have a menu bar item put one there, especially as they almost always do by default. And it's like, now we're running all the time to help you out. It's like, no, you're running all the time to help you out, not to help me out. So yeah, I am totally with you on basically keeping these sprawling businesses apps from sprawling all over my computer. It's like your business is making you do this, but that's not my problem. My problem is this utility app that I thought was only going to do this one basic thing in a normal way wants to grab more real estate than I think it deserves.
Except for my two apps, which do have to be running all the time and only appear in the menu bar. They're fine, right?
Are they Electron?
They're
Brutal.
They are not, but if they're not running all the time, they don't work. So there's that.
So Andrew Byer in the chat is telling me one of the big, Andrew works on 1Password. One of the big changes between 1Password 7 and 8 is our change from Safari app extensions to a web extension, which comes with some new Apple API issues. Safari 15 brings a bunch of improvements on macOS, like the popover opening speed. So I'm hopeful to see that those improvements land. And I think, like I was alluding to earlier, perhaps I was using like an ancient version of the extension, and that's part of the reason why I find this new one so crummy, is because not only is it working with the crummier native app, but on top of that, I'm using the crummier new APIs that Apple is giving 1Password. So it's just crummy all the way down. And those are just a handful of examples of why I was not in love and am not in love with the new beta. Again, it is certainly possible all these things will be fixed. I'd be surprised, but it is possible. But the thing of it is that 1Password, as I've said this before, I'll say it a few more times, was always, to use a Gruberism, it was always a Mac-assed Mac app. It was always a really strong, really solid Mac app. I'm sure I could come up with complaints about 1Password 7, but for the most part, it was a really great shining example, almost to a panic level of what a great Mac app could be. And I would say the same of the iOS apps too. I'm sure I could come up with complaints, but on the whole, they were really, really, really great, solid apps. And now I feel like it's an app on my computer. It's just another one. And that's fine. Like, I guess one could argue that I should not get my engine revved as much as I used to by a password manager. But darn it, there's not a lot of things to be happy about these days, and it always made me happy. And 1Password 8 does not make me happy. With that said, to give credit where credit is potentially due, I did not take this, or I did not compare to 1Password 7, but I did look at the memory usage of 1Password 8. And one of the things that people love to whine about, including me, with regard to Electron-powered stuff, is that it uses a butt-ton of memory. And when I looked earlier today, I was using about 135 megs of memory at idle, which is a lot and is more than it should be, but is not like the 17 gigs that Chrome uses when it's looking at, about blank. So it certainly could be worse. There is a long explanation that Dave Tier wrote. Dave was one of the co-founders of 1Password, that explains kind of the history of 1Password for Linux, and he and I exchanged a couple of tweets earlier today. Again, nicest guy. Everyone there is so nice. David offered, and we just crisscrossed on timing, to get on the phone with me to talk about kind of the motivations of why they're going the way they're going, which most of me honestly does not really care or want to hear. But because I love 1Password and the people there so much, I was going to hear them out and at least entertain the conversation. As it turns out, the timing just didn't work out. But this Medium post goes through, like, how did 1Password land on Electron power, being powered by Electron as the way forward? And I guess what I keep coming back to, and it is so easy for me to armchair quarterback, but hey, that's what I do for a living now. It's so easy for me to armchair quarterback, but it seems to me that this is not the way forward that I want, or that I think ultimately 1Password wants, because what it gives them is a kind of meh experience everywhere, rather than a certainly more difficult, more expensive, more time consuming, but ultimately excellent experience everywhere. And I think I don't want to get into it yet, but I think we should talk a little bit about what their alternatives were, both with regards to SwiftUI and Catalyst. But let's put that in the parking lot for a minute, and let's come back to that. I don't know. I've been talking for a long time, gentlemen. What's your take on this?
You should mention the blog post on the 1Password site itself that also goes through this from a slightly different perspective than the Medium post. In fact, that's the first place I would say you should look to, where the company explains, how did we end up where we are? We previously had like a Mac app and a Windows app or whatever. How did we end up where we have this Electron app across all the platforms? And I think it explains it well. There's a bunch of quotes in here about their various requirements, and it explains basically that there's like a plan A and a plan B, or I don't even know which one would be A or B. But when they did the Mac app, they had the Electron one, and they also had a SwiftUI app, and they were doing both, presumably to see like which one's going to work out better. And in the end, the one that worked out better was the Electron one. And so they went with that. Like, it's not like they decided from day one we're going Electron everywhere. They were hedging their bet, saying we should try making a native Mac app, try using SwiftUI, get some cross-platform stuff with iOS and iPadOS or whatever. And it just turned out that the Electron one was the better bet. But anyway, they explain it in the blog post. You can read it. But I think they go into this a little bit, but the underlying assumption, which I think is true, is that part of 1Password's value as a product is the fact that it is cross-platform. Apple's keychain is just now trying to kind of be like that. Oh, hey, we have a Windows app, but 1Password runs on Linux, for crying out loud. It runs on Android, runs on Windows, runs like their selling point is, especially for a password manager, as Marco figured out, even if you are essentially a one platform household, using a password manager that is available many different places can come in surprisingly handy that one time you do end up having an Android phone briefly or having a Windows PC for gaming or whatever. It's convenient, because that's exactly the type of thing. Like, when you go to another password platform, your passwords don't change or disappear. Like, you still have whatever, your Dropbox account, your Microsoft account, your login to Amazon.com, whatever, right? That's still you. You are the same person, so why shouldn't your passwords come with you? So it makes perfect sense that a company like 1Password correctly realizes, two things. One, a great part of our value is that we're cross-platform, and two, within the realm of any single platform, we are essentially competing against the platform vendor. Apple has a solution to this called iCloud Keychain, right? But, and if you're 1Password, you're like, well, on the Apple platform, not that our days are numbered, because Apple's probably never going to have all the features that 1Password does, and 1Password probably cares more about this than Apple does. But anytime you're competing with a built-in feature, the built-in feature doesn't actually have to be better than you to sort of gobble up your market share. So it's kind of dangerous to sort of bet the future of your company on the fact that we'll always have a better password manager than Apple, and people will be able to recognize that we have the better password manager and reward us by paying money for a thing they could get for free with their OS. It's much better to say we need to go cross-platform because we feel like that's an area where maybe they at one time thought that's an area where Apple won't go. Apple has proved them wrong with their Windows iCloud stuff that they've been doing in recent years. But you can have more confidence that even if Apple does go there, Apple's track record of making really good Windows apps has not been great. See Safari for Windows, QuickTime for Windows, basically anything they've ever done for Windows. The Boot Camp drivers for Windows, maybe. So that's a better strategy for the company. So that's the context of this thing. Why do they care about cross-platform? And then from there, everything else follows this in this blog post. Like, how many people are me? How much money has been invested? The investors want to see on their return on their investment. We need to do the thing that is the strength of our company, right? How much time and energy have we spent for the past years, with all the years that Casey loved, where they had a really, Mac native app, as they describe in their blog post. It became a problem trying to coordinate two teams making two separate applications, and it was making them as a company move more slowly and take more time to add features. Kind of like reading the threat model of the CSAM thing. If you read the document in isolation, you will be nodding your head and going, yes, yeah, this all makes sense, right? But where the rubber meets the road is what Casey was talking about. Is like, okay, but I'm not an employee or shareholder of 1Password. I'm just a user of their product, and my experience has gotten worse. Now, I have to say the list of things that Casey went down here, a lot of them seem like, potential beta bugs or small things that aren't a big deal. But I think the earlier point that you made about Visual Studio is a good one. Most users don't know or care what API their app uses, but within any given API, you can have a good Electron app or you can have a bad one. My choice for a good Electron app, I think Slack is still Electron, right? Or an app that uses web technologies or web views or whatever. There is a huge difference between a good Electron app and a bad one. I say this as someone who uses Teams and Slack. I don't know if Teams is Electron. I hope it is, because there's no other excuse for it to be so horrible on the Mac. It looks like it's using web technology. It is so much worse than Slack. It's not even funny, right? Same thing, pick an API. UIKit on the iPhone. You can make a good app with UIKit, and you can make a bad app, right? And I think the range between a good app within a given framework and a bad app within a given framework is probably bigger than the average range between apps on different frameworks, right? So it's not ridiculous to think that 1Password strategy of using Electron, like it has huge benefits for their ability, for their velocity, as we say in the business, for their ability to get features out the door in a timely manner, to have a consistent experience across all their platforms, to be able to roll out features simultaneously. Like there's all these reasons. And the Rust backend is, like making the core in a cross-platform Rust, a language with more safety features. Like it all makes tech sense. But I don't want to minimize Casey's, complaints here, because the bottom line is, you would hope 1Password 8, here it is, that as a user of this app, you would be excited because the app would get, in your estimation, better. And thus far, Casey is not excited about the app getting better. I mean, you can offset this with new features, and maybe if you did hop across platforms a lot, you would enjoy the consistency, where before they were different for weird reasons, or they got features at different times. But that's the challenge for 1Password, the company, and the product is to, one, make a really good Electron app, and two, try not to downgrade the user experience of your customers from what they are previously accustomed to. And it sounds like, at least in Casey's estimation, it feels like a downgrade right now, even though it's just a beta.
It definitely does feel like a downgrade. But again, the complaints I have so far are beta kind of complaints. And they're not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. And the actual app itself, I haven't spent too much time with it today. I feel like there's a lot of white space here that isn't necessary, but that's a quibble of a quibble of a quibble. The app itself seems like it's perfectly functional and will work just fine, which really, especially for a beta this early, is pretty high praise. Like if the app itself is workable and sufficient, then one could make an argument that I should get off my high horse, and you might be right, and just shut up and deal. But it just makes me sad, man, because it was such a great app.
That's not what I said at all.
No. I'm not saying, no. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth at all. I just mean in general, one could say, the royal you could say that, I'm whining and moaning about nothing. And maybe that's true, but I don't know. It makes me so sad that what was once a shining example, at least today, is not a shining example. Now, maybe it will be later. I don't know, but it's not today. And it still bums me out.
Do you feel like it's a good Electron app? Like, compare it to whatever your favorite is, Visual Studio Code, Slack, or whatever. Do you feel like it is within the bounds of Electron and web technology? Does it feel like a good one, or does it feel like Teams?
Well, I haven't used Teams, but I take the point you're driving at. Yeah, it's good. It's good. But again, like I would never say that about the old 1Password. I would say it's friggin' great. But
yeah, you were enthusiastic. Yeah, I totally get it. So here's the thing. Like, I don't want to take 1Password off the hook, because as they outlined in their thing here, like an option that was on the table is to just continue making a complete native Mac app like they had always made, with a Rust core underneath it, which would probably mean rewriting the whole thing from scratch or whatever. But that would be more expensive and time consuming and difficult than doing what they did, right? And maybe they'll change their mind about that depending on what the feedback is like, or maybe most people don't even care, and as long as they make a good Electron app, it'll be fine. But there is a portion of blame for this whole situation that lands squarely in the lap of Apple, and it's not really super Apple's. I mean,
we'll get there.
I'm not going to say I'm going to get there now, because I don't think I want to give.
Come on, I want to talk about 1Password.
No. Yeah, give Marco a chance.
I'll jump to it. Go ahead. Have you used it? I wasn't aware you'd used the version 8 yet.
I haven't, and that's kind of what I think this is. I want to split this discussion between. I want to in a moment. I want to close the book on 1Password and have kind of a separate discussion about the problem of Swift UI and Apple's cross-platform stuff, and how Electron plays into that. Because I think the reason why we're seeing all this rage at 1Password over this right now, I think, is a combination of factors. I mean, first of all, many long-time 1Password consumer users have been upset with the company's overall direction in the last few years towards their own sync service, with towards subscription pricing, and this is 1Password has kind of borne the brunt of a lot of just the general consumer resentment towards things moving towards subscription pricing and like that. So there's a lot of that going into this. I think it's also worth noting the context of the changes that 1Password has been going through as a company in the last few years. The news came out a couple weeks ago about their new fundraising round, and I think this surprised a lot of people, myself included, with quite how big of a company they are now. So I pasted the link here. So, it's raised $100 million. It's their second round. And then I think what's most interesting here is looking at how different the numbers are between their first round from 2 years ago and now. So they went in 2 years from 174 employees, which is way higher than I would have guessed that they had, to 475. So at 475 employees currently work at 1Password. It is a massive company. They do $120 million in revenue. And if you look at also like they've getting into a lot more, way more business stuff than anything that the three of us would probably even know about, let alone use.
They should be sponsoring us more. I didn't know they had that much money. Yeah. Buy some more ads. It's chump change for you.
And their number of business customers has nearly doubled in that time, according to all this news. So, like, if you look at, like, this is a company that has exploded in money, in people, in focus, and in scope over the last couple of years. And for those of us, like the three of us, or two of us, John, you don't even use it, do you?
No, I don't use it, but I do recommend other people use it.
Right. So for Casey and I, and many of the listeners who are big 1Password fans for years, not only does this stuff mostly happen without us even knowing about it, like all this growth into business and everything, but most of this is stuff that will actively make this company worse for serving our needs, or at least will incentivize them to go in much different directions and focus in much different directions. And so I think this is why so much of this frustration and anger over the move to an Electron app has hit 1Password in particular, because they already had these other factors going that were getting them a lot of resentment among certain groups of the community. And I think that's not to be overlooked. I also think, despite what Casey says, I would not call 1Password, the previous version, a quote Mac app. It does use native frameworks, but it has a ton of custom UI, and it always has. And I actually think it works pretty well, but I can see why they are going in an Electron direction, because from their point of view, it was already super custom.
Certainly.
And I don't even necessarily care that much for the reasons why most people don't like Electron apps. Most of the reasons are things like, well, it doesn't resize smoothly. Well, you know what? I don't resize my windows that often. I don't care. Or like it doesn't use the fully native UI. It's like, well, look at this app. This is not native UI, or this is not. I mean, standard. I would say standard UI. So already, we're already out of that realm here. What I care about with Electron apps now. Okay, we're gonna slice this conversation right here. This chapter change. All right, that was 1Password. Now we're gonna talk about UI frameworks and the challenges there. What I care a lot about with Electron apps is not that they don't resize smoothly. It's not that their preferences window is a weird overlay inside the main window. That I honestly don't care much about that at all, because those things don't get in my way very often. What gets in my way very often is two things: how incredibly bloated they are, especially at launch time, and how they tend to deviate from system standard behaviors, especially around things like keyboard navigation, shortcuts, things like that. And
accessibility.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah. I mean, that's, that doesn't affect me personally right at this moment very much, but that affects a ton of people in huge ways. So that's a huge one. So Electron apps in general, because they are this, basically web views with fancy stuff around them or, within them, but basically all this, custom web stuff, they tend to have a lot of just little paper cuts in use, just little things that don't work the way the system works, little behaviors that are a little bit different as you navigate or as you work through the app or as you use keyboards or big things as you use assistive technologies. So there's all sorts of little ways that Electron apps make the customer experience worse. And two of the biggest ones are memory usage, disk space, and I guess launch time too, and counting. And to me, the move to Electron, it has these externalities. It's kind of like our Bitcoin discussion, but on a much smaller level. It has these externalities of we're going to waste significantly more memory, significantly more disk space, more time to launch the app, et cetera. Like we're going to really bloat up the app's technical resource needs in a way that doesn't really help our customers at all. And we are actually foisting the externality of that onto our customers, onto all their devices. So we're going to take up all this disk space around the world, all this extra RAM around the world, on all these computers. We're going to make everyone's experience a little bit worse in order to save us some time and money. I think that's one of the reasons why this rubs people the wrong way. But I think that ultimately gets down to that's the biggest problem I have with Electron apps. Again, it's not the animations and stuff. I honestly, that's fine. my password manager has always looked totally weird compared to other apps. I still like it. It's because it worked well. But if this move is going to make it work with as much mediocrity as every other Electron app I've ever seen, including things, Slack, I've used it enough now. I've seen enough. I know how this is likely to go. And even if they take all the care in the world to try to do their best, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be like a native app. It's going to be full of all those paper cuts, maybe fewer of them than if they, hadn't cared at all to fix any of them. But there's going to be all those paper cuts all throughout it. And for a company that has about 475 employees, I know these aren't all engineers. I know engineering and scaling engineering resources, these are not simple things. But I just... Ooh, I fell back into 1Password. Whoops. I just don't think this was a good decision of resource allocation. Like that, because it's not like they're starting from scratch. They already had native apps, so it's like they're throwing that away or throwing much of that away. And I just, it seems like many common engineering foibles have happened here. They tried something new. It didn't work out. We'll get to that in a moment. Don't worry, John. They tried something new. It didn't work out. And so they didn't even seem to consider, well, why don't we just do what we were doing before?
Well, I mean, the reason they didn't do what they were doing before, they explained in the blog post, because what they were doing before, they knew for a fact had these certain problems in terms of coordination and time to market and synchronizing features between things. And like that's why they didn't just say, why don't we just go back to what we're doing before? So I kind of understand where they're coming from. Like they had a status quo, and the status quo was not meeting the needs of the business. So they needed to do something.
I mean, yeah, I get that argument. I don't necessarily know if I agree with the conclusions that companies come to sometimes with that argument, which often leads to things like Electron, because it's very much the grass is always greener situation to a large degree. Electron is not free, and it has its own downsides. And I mean, this is true. Like anytime a large engineering decision is made to switch to some massive new framework, for instance, I think even trying Swift UI for a company of this size, for a company that the Mac app is so important, I think they should never even tried Swift UI like that. One engineer should have tried it for a weekend, realized it's not ready, and stopped. Mm-hmm. So the fact that they had invested very heavily into it, I think that shows like that was a misdirection. I think. Anyway, so again, I don't want to spend too much time on them specifically on this because I think it's much more about the general, Electron in general. My problem with it is that that externalizing the downsides to your user base to save yourself, a couple engineers when you're a big company like that to me, I don't appreciate that as a user of these things. And as a 1Password user in particular, God, I fell back into it again. I see why people are mad because they've taken the same path as Dropbox and many other companies where it starts out as this consumer thing that we all love. And then it turns out, the consumer thing can't really have this massive explosive growth business, or it's hard when the platform makers move into it, or whatever. There's major reasons why they want to explode into the business world. So the company, balloons in size and in financing, and they explode into the business world and do all these business features, and it leaves behind people like us who are like, well, we didn't really want any of that, and then now this thing that we like and have come to rely on, and that doesn't have a lot of good alternatives, is now going in this massive direction that is actively against the things that we like or that we value or that we need. We are sponsored this week by Linode, my favorite place to run servers. Visit linode.com/ATP and see why Linode has been voted the top infrastructure as a service provider by both G2 and TrustRadius. From their award-winning support, which is offered 24/7, 365, and that's regardless of your plan size, from that $5 a month plan all the way up to as many servers as you can put there, everyone gets that same amazing level of support. So from that to their ease of use, their great setup, it's clear why developers like me have been trusting Linode for projects both big and small since 2003. You can deploy your entire application stack with Linode's one-click app marketplace, or build it all from scratch and manage everything yourself with supported centralized tools like Terraform. Linode offers the best price-to-performance ratio for all compute instances, including GPU compute instances, as well as block storage, Kubernetes, and their upcoming bare metal release. Quite frankly, this is what drew me to Linode in the first place. Years ago when I started there, way before they were a sponsor of anything, I pay for it all myself. It's wonderful. It's a great value. And I care about that value. I care about what I'm getting for my money. And in hosting, sometimes you get a place that's like a good value for a year or two, and then it's not anymore. Linode has been an amazing value the entire time I've been a customer. They always give you more for your money. As technology moves forward, they give you more for the buck. It's fantastic. Linode makes cloud computing fast, simple, and affordable, allowing you to focus on your projects, not your servers. Visit linode.com/ATP, create a free account with either your Google or GitHub account or just your email address, and you get $100 in free credit. Once again, linode.com/ATP, create your free account to get $100 in credit. I love Linode. If you got to run servers somewhere, I strongly recommend Linode. Thank you so much to Linode for sponsoring our show and hosting all my stuff. Electron. Go ahead, John.
All right. So the framework question. This is tangentially related to 1Password, but is actually more of an Apple problem that they have to deal with, right? So the reason 1Password looked at Swift UI is because in theory, and as pitched by Apple, Swift UI is a framework where you can write an application and you can use a lot of that same code, if not the exact same application, depending on how you want to try to do it, on the Mac, on the phone, on the iPad, on the watch. Like, it's Apple's cross-platform UI framework to the extent that it exists. So if part of the deal of this thing is, hey, we've got a problem, we've got all these native apps, the coordination is a big problem for us, let's try to unify, right? Step one of the unification that we haven't talked too much about is sort of doing the core in Rust in a cross-platform way, and I think that's a great idea. When we talk about the core, we're talking about like the part that doesn't have a user interface, just the guts of the machine. Using Rust, which is a language that has lots of rules about memory ownership and type safety and everything, is a great idea for a security-conscious application rather than, say, writing it in C or some other language that has lots of security problems. Great, make your core in that, right? Like that's our new generation. We used to have the core, but it was different on different platforms and it was kind of a pain. Let's write a new core in Rust. Then you have this core with no interface, and you have to decide, how do I put an interface on this? And 1Password didn't immediately jump to, let's just do Electron everywhere. We use the Rust core and then we'll do Electron for our UI. That wasn't their first thing. They thought of, okay, on Apple's platform, Apple actually has a newish native UI framework that can target more than one Apple platform. So no, you can't use Swift UI across all of our platforms, Linux, Android, Windows, but we can get pretty much all the Apple platforms we care about with this one framework. So let's consider a bifurcated strategy, which is like Electron everywhere, except for on Apple platforms, we'll try using Swift UI, which in itself is, and Jason Snell wrote the story recently saying how the Mac just wasn't important enough for 1Password to do this. And in the end, that is true. But the idea that they looked at Swift UI at all shows that 1Password kind of knows where its bread is buttered. I don't know what their financials are, but 1Password with his roots as a Mac company, right? I think they were Mac first, right? For years before they even branched out. I don't know if that's true, but I've always thought of them as a Mac company, was considering doing a totally different framework just for Apple's platforms. Maybe that makes financial sense. I don't know what percentage of 1Password's customers are on Apple platforms versus not, but that was a thing that they considered, which I think shows that either financially it makes some sense for them to do that, or just emotionally because they feel the roots in the Apple platform that they were considering doing that, right? That didn't work out for reasons that, anyone who's tried to use Swift UI in the past several years understands. Swift UI is young. It has lots of limitations. I don't think it's impossible to pull off a 1Password application with Swift UI, but you would then have to decide what to mix it with, because there are things that the Swift UI can't do or can't do easily or can't do feasibly, and you have to mix it with something. So you can mix Swift UI with AppKit like I do in my apps. You can mix Swift UI with UIKit and a Catalyst app. What are the other options you have? I mean, you can do pure Swift UI, but that's probably, like I said, that's probably not going to fly. And then once you're doing that, now you're losing a lot of the cross-platform part of it, depending on how you look at it. If you do it in Catalyst, you can say, well, if we're going to do it in Catalyst, why do we need SwiftUI at all? Why don't we just use a Catalyst app for our Mac and then use that same UI kit code for the phone and the iPad? And you have a whole bunch of different options on the various Apple platforms, right? But they didn't have time to run all those experiments. So they said, well, when the SwiftUI one didn't work out, let's just do Electron everywhere because Electron runs on the Mac. But that whole soup that I just explained is part of Apple's problem. SwiftUI is Apple's newest framework, and it is the one that has the potential to run on the most platforms, but it's young and it's not really up to maybe the task of an app like 1Password at this point. Catalyst also exists, and it's a way if you are coming from a UI kit and you either have an existing UI kit application on the iPad or the iPhone, or you just know UI kit because you've been developing on those platforms, but you want to write a Mac app, now you can write a Mac app in UI kit, sneaking into AppKit every once in a while to do stuff. And then, of course, there's AppKit, the old API that is superseded maybe by Catalyst and or SwiftUI. This is not a great situation for the Mac because like the reason you see among the little circles that we travel in lots of discussions of all these different words, Catalyst, AppKit, and SwiftUI, is that there is no obvious answer for all situations on how to develop a native Mac app. Setting aside Electron, what should I use? And there's it's like a flow chart of like, well, do you have an existing UIKit app? Are you writing from scratch? Do you have an existing AppKit app? Are you going to target the watch? Are you going to target the iPhone? Like, how complicated is your application? What is your tolerance for bugs and immaturity? Apple has been in this place before, many, many times over the years. I'm just going to go back to the most recent one, but there are, if you keep going back in time, there's more and more ones for even older people. The most recent time Apple found itself in a scenario is the dawn of Mac OS X. Before Mac OS X, Apple tried to do an OS called Rhapsody, which is basically the same as Mac OS X, but without the ability to easily port classic Mac OS apps to it. And that OS strategy didn't fly. Mostly because the companies that had existing Mac apps said, yeah, no, we're not going to rewrite our apps. Like Microsoft said, no, we're not rewriting Office for the next step APIs. And Adobe said, no, we're not rewriting Photoshop for the next step APIs, right? So Apple had to come up with Mac OS X, which was basically Rhapsody plus a new API called Carbon, which was essentially the parts of the old classic Mac API that they could port in a safe way to a modern operating system, right? And then Microsoft ported its apps to Carbon, and Adobe ported its apps to Carbon. And then all the next developers ported their apps to Cocoa. Not ported, they were already basically, they renamed a bunch of stuff and got their AppKit apps to run in Cocoa. And for many, many years, it seemed like a longer time than it actually was, but for many years in the beginning of Mac OS X, there were two ways to write a native Mac OS X app. You could write in Carbon, and you could write in Cocoa. And people would ask questions. I want to write a Mac app. Which API should I use? And you'd go through the flowchart. Do you have an existing Mac app? If you do, you should probably use Carbon because you can easily port it to that. Do you have an existing Next Step app? If you do, you should use Cocoa because it's basically the same API and you just rename some stuff and it'll be fine. What if I'm starting from scratch? Well, do you know Objective-C? What's Objective-C? How do you feel about square brackets? Like, what language do you know? What APIs do you know? Have you ever made another Mac app before? What APIs are you familiar with, right? And aside from the obvious ones, which is like, hey, I've got Adobe Photoshop. I should obviously go with Carbon because I'm not rewriting it in Next Step. Or I've got like OmniWeb. I should obviously use AppKit because that's the one. There was no obvious answer, and Apple wouldn't tell you like what you should do. They would just say, well, like use the one that you prefer. We try to give them feature parity. And as the years went on, sometimes a feature would appear in AppKit first. Sometimes a feature would appear in Carbon first. Some features were only available in Carbon, like a bunch of stuff having to do with classic Mac OS and the QuickTime stuff or whatever. And then eventually some features were only available in Cocoa. And Apple had a bunch of WWDCs where they do these sessions where we're going to do feature parity and we're not going to do that anymore. And every new thing that we come out with is going to be in Carbon and Cocoa at the same time. And you can see how, like, in one way, this is a necessary strategy because you can't have it in OS unless you can bring along all the apps. You need Microsoft Office, you need Internet Explorer, whatever the hell, right? And all these new Cocoa apps are new and exciting. They let individuals make applications on their own that become popular, like NetNewsWire, written by one person through the magic of Cocoa. Like, These are both good things. I don't want to give either one of them up. I can't give up Carbon. And matter of fact is major parts of the operating system are Carbon only, and Cocoa apps end up needing to call into Carbon to do those things. But I can't give up Cocoa because there's so much excitement happening there. And people are writing apps that, very quickly and writing these feature-filled apps because Cocoa is this amazing framework and they're learning Objective-C and blah, blah, blah. During that time, a lot of developers really wished, Apple, just tell us which one we should use. Like which one should we use? Is it going to be Carbon forever and ever, or is it going to be Cocoa forever? Because you can't have both because it's just too confusing. And Apple would say, well, we need to have both right now. But developers, if you're on the Cocoa side, you were saying we should just get rid of this Carbon garbage. It's terrible. Objective-C is the future. Everything should be AppKit. And if you're Carbon, you'd be like, what the hell is this Objective-C stuff? Like no one uses that language. It makes no sense. It's so ugly. The API is stupid. All the real features are in Carbon. Why don't we just forget about that, just like we forgot about the Java interface to it, and just go with Carbon forever? And, eventually, after what seemed like way, way too long, Apple made a decision. And the decision was, Carbon, you're out. and it's Cocoa from here on. And that was incredibly clarifying. For there was a period of time where you said, if you want to make a native application, Mac application, how do I do it? The answer was AppKit, Cocoa, period. That was it, because Carbon didn't come to 64-bit. And once the OS was 64-bit only, which also took a long time, your only option was AppKit. And yeah, there's, other models of building applications. You can make a Java app, but like a native Java app with all its widgets and web technologies and all sorts of stuff like that. But eventually, they made the call. We are back now in a situation that's even worse, where we have Catalyst, which is good for UIKit things. We have Swift UI, which is kind of like the new Cocoa. It's like the new hotness, although, obviously Cocoa was a decade-old technology when Apple bought it, unlike Swift UI. And then we have AppKit still lurking back there. All three of those things work today to make a Mac application. And Apple will not tell you which one of those is the real future. Maybe because they don't know. But right now, they're doing the thing they did for years with Carbon and Cocoa. It's like, they're all pretty good. Just pick the one that's best for you. I don't think that's a good strategy. But on the other hand, I don't think it's a good strategy to ditch one at this point because, Catalyst debatably, when Catalyst came out, we didn't know about Swift UI. So Catalyst seemed like the future of the Mac. But then Swift UI came out and it's like, no, what the hell is the future, right? And so if you're 1Password and you're trying to make a native Mac app, forget about Electron. It's not even clear what you should do. The only thing that's clear is that AppKit is probably not the future. But it's also the most full-featured API in the platform, and it can do all the things, and you can make amazing apps with it. But you're doing it, you feel like this is just not the future, because this is not Apple has introduced 2 new frameworks since then that both have a lot to say for them, right? Catalyst is great, and it's shared with UIKit and has great benefits as me as a developer. But Swift UI is the new hotness. But then there's AppKit that has all the features. And if I use Swift UI or Catalyst, I also have to go back into AppKit to get those features. So maybe AppKit's the new Carbon. And is AppKit not going to be ported to 128K or 128-bit? That's a joke. That's not coming. Don't worry. It's super confusing. So I understand Apple's situation. I understand why Apple doesn't come out and say, Swift UI, number 1, that's the future. Everyone should go for it. Catalyst, weird stopgap. Don't worry about it. It's cool if you're going to port apps. AppKit, forget it. Screw it. It's dead, right? They don't say that. And so every Mac developer has this difficult choice to make that's make or break your app, right? I almost feel worse for the people who have picked one, who have said, I'm all in on Catalyst. Because what if Catalyst is the one that doesn't make it? I guess you get a few good years out of it. You got to not reuse a lot of your work that you did with UIKit, reuse your knowledge or whatever. It's great. But then 5 years from now, Catalyst is sunset over the course of a few OS releases. You're going to have to rewrite your app in Swift UI or AppKit if AppKit is still around, right? And same thing is true. If Swift UI just doesn't work out and ends up fizzling and Catalyst is the true future and you really bought in on Swift UI, what are you going to do then? So I feel for 1Password in this situation, it is almost like the safest bet in terms of future-proofing is to defer this decision and say, we're just going to go with Electron for now. Because they tried Swift UI and it wasn't ready, and I totally believe them on that, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely right? Believe them.
And then, and they probably didn't have time to go back on Catalyst, and it's we don't know we don't know which horse to bet on. So if we just do Electron and don't bet on any horse and go with a donkey, right, then we can just wait this out. And if it turns out our Mac customers really hate this and our Apple customers want us to do native, maybe by the time we revisit the decision in a year or two, it'll become more clear what we're supposed to do. But I really, really feel like Apple's current strategy of supporting both Catalyst and SwiftUI as the modern options on the Mac is untenable in the medium term. Within the next 5 years, Apple needs to make a call, I think, because there's just no way to support 3 major UI frameworks plus all the shared underlying stuff on the Mac and then complain when people choose Electron instead. Because like, well, what was my alternative? One of this, alphabet soup of vaguely intercompatible APIs, none of which I can use in isolation to make a quote unquote full-featured native Mac app. Because at this point, you can't even use I don't know. You can probably still use AppKit to make a full-featured app. Is there anything you need to go into Catalyst or SwiftUI for?
No, right now, whatever you want to do on the Mac, AppKit does it. And AppKit is, the parallel on iOS is obviously UIKit. It's like that's like the main framework that the other frameworks seem to be implemented in, on the underlying levels, or at least in part. And AppKit is like, it's the one that will be supported and maintained probably the longest on the Mac. I mean, in this case, like I think SwiftUI, and it's a whole discussion probably for another day, but SwiftUI started as a watch framework, and then the other OSs kind of snatched it up and made it their own as well. But it started on the watch, and if you use SwiftUI on all these platforms, that will make a lot of sense to know that, because on the watch, it's pretty good, and it was very badly needed compared to old WatchKit UI stuff. That was terrible, and so it was badly needed. And SwiftUI does well in simple contexts where the scope of what you're trying to do with the UI is fairly low. It's not that complicated. You're using mostly default behaviors and appearances of things. You're not doing a lot of customization. And you have relatively simple views and relatively simple needs and simple data models. Watch apps tend to have that because watch apps have to be simplified for lots of other reasons. So it makes tons of sense on the watch, which is why it was born there. And it also has less problem area to cover, and it's most mature there. So on the watch, SwiftUI is a no-brainer. Yeah, if you're making an app on the watch, use SwiftUI, period. As you move up to the quote larger, I guess, by screen size or by complexity, certainly, as you move to the larger platforms, on the phone, SwiftUI is, well, it's a little less usable than on the watch. There's more rough edges, there's more bugs, there's more walls that you hit trying to do common customizations or common behaviors that UIKit apps have been doing forever. You hit more of those walls on iOS than you on watchOS for sure. You can tell that it's a little less tested. It's a few more rough edges, and there are more ways once you go from watchOS to iOS in SwiftUI. There are more ways in which the SwiftUI model of doing things kind of breaks down or starts having a lot of really ugly, things you have to be doing and jumping through hoops to get it to work right. Well, then take that onto the Mac, and you scale it up even further onto this. The Mac is now even further than the watch, in scope and everything. Mac apps tend to be significantly more complicated than iOS apps in their UIs and their behaviors and what they have to accommodate, what they have to do, what's important. And also, the Mac, unlike iOS, is a way lower priority. It gets way less engineering attention, in software terms. The UI frame, SwiftUI in the Mac, doesn't seem like it's getting a lot of attention from anybody, because what a surprise. Look at macOS software quality over the last decade. It's not as high of a priority as iOS. And so you have this framework that's been, it's pretty opinionated and still pretty young and has a lot of really rough edges. And it's pretty good on the platform that it was made for. But as you get bigger and more complicated, and then in the case of the Mac, as you get seemingly a lot less resources devoted to it, I don't think SwiftUI on the Mac is ever going to be great. I suspect SwiftUI on the Mac to always be this kind of experimental thing that a lot of people try to use, doesn't work out very well, and they go to something else. And then the problem there is what John was saying. Well, what do you go to? And AppKit is actually the right answer. Unfortunately, it doesn't feel good to go to AppKit for a brand new app in 2021. It feels like that's probably a bad decision, but with the realities of macOS engineering priorities and quality priorities, I don't think Swift UI is ever going to be the right move on Mac. And Catalyst, I think, has proven to be kind of like Electron. There's a lot of downsides to usability.
It's more like Carbon because it's saying, hey, we have a bunch of customers who have existing apps who would like to reuse that code and that skills on a different platform. So, Catalyst is just Carbon for UIKit, right? That's essentially what it is. It's even better than Carbon because you don't even have to change as much code, and they didn't have to. But that's, we have to bring along these developers because this is where all our developers know UIKit. Very few of them know Mac stuff. If you want more Mac apps, we need a way for run UIKit on here. But it feels like Carbon. It feels like, all right, well, these people need to be able to bring their stuff along, and it feels like early Carbon where there's not parity between the UIs and they're very different, right? And so it's not clear, again, before Swift UI, Catalyst is I think this is the name of the episode Extinction Level Event, when it's like, well, that's it for AppKit then, because once you bring Catalyst over here, all those, why would anyone ever learn AppKit again? Because if you don't need to learn it and you already know UIKit and you have a way to run those apps on here, why wouldn't just everybody do that? But now Swift UI is in the mix and it's even more confusing. And I want to say about Swift UI, the fact that it started out on the watch, I think I agree with you that I would say it remains an open question as to whether the sort of the API paradigm of declarative interfaces as defined by Swift UI is sufficient or a good way to make very complicated Mac apps. The reason we don't know that yet is because Swift UI currently lacks tons of features that it just doesn't have the features. And that's why people bang their head against the wall trying to make Swift UI do a thing that it doesn't have features for yet, right? Once they add the feature to Swift UI, sometimes it's easy to do whatever the thing that you were trying to do. But if it doesn't have that feature at all, like, first responder or, controlling focus, trying to get that to work in some weird way feels terrible. But if and when they add that feature, it's like, oh, now it's easy, right? But still.
Honestly, I disagree with you on this. I think the biggest pain points of Swift UI, in my experience, again, I haven't tried making a Mac app with it. I have, a lot of experience on the watch, some experience on iOS so far. My experience with Swift UI is not running into missing features. It's running into capabilities or behaviors that are really easy in UIKit, in procedural programming, that are just really hard because of Swift UI's model. That just like this declarative model, the things that it makes easy or easier, it's like magic when you use it and you can make something so fast. I love Swift UI when I'm working within the things it's good at.
Yep.
And then I hit some little thing. It's like, wait a minute. I can't ship this like this. I have to have it, like when it has to like deselect the cell correctly when I go back here or whatever. And I run into some little behavioral detail like that, and I just can't do that. Like it's not. It isn't that it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's a missing feature though, because if you had the undefocused unselect, that would take you 2 seconds worth of typing if that feature existed.
Well, sometimes it's a missing feature, but sometimes it's just like I can't do this thing I'm trying to do, and I understand why I can't do it because the way the procedural nature or the declarative nature of this, yeah, that would be really hard to model in this kind of thing, or I can do it, but it requires all this ugly crap hack workaround because that's just not a thing that declarative UIs are well representing.
That's why I say it's an open question though, because the flip side is also true. There are things that are a super pain in the butt to do in an imperative language that are trivial to do in a declarative one. And the open question is, what does that ratio break down as? Like the things that Swift UI is good at versus the things that a non-declarative API is good at. What is the ratio of those in a typical app? And it's modified by like you not having experience with this API, lots of people not having experience with an API like this, right? But that's why I feel like you need more features to be able to build bigger apps. And then when you build the bigger apps, you need to figure out, are the things that Swift UI is good at enough to offset the things it's bad at? Because I think it's a pretty non-overlapping set of like the things that AppKit is good at and the thing that it's bad at. Like it's a complementary, set with Swift UI. There's not a lot of overlap just because the models are so different, right? But what I wanted to get at with this having origins on the watch is that one thing in Swift UI's favor is it does, well, there's two sides to it. It does a lot of things to be efficient. One of the advantages of being a declarative API is it's harder for you to add code that slows the system down because it takes your whole model, turns it into a structure, figures out like all the view combining and crap that you would have to do in like AppKit apps manually to improve your performance problems after watching 50 WWDC sessions. SwiftUI is doing that for you internally. Like you don't have to do that. The framework does it. The framework will, in theory, figure out how to make your thing fast, figure out how to combine your views. Like, don't worry about making tons of little views in SwiftUI. It's not actually making NS views for every single one of those things. The system will figure it out, right? Because it has to be efficient because it has to run the watch. The other side of that is, yeah, but the watch doesn't have much crap going on in it. So really, has this actually been tested? Yes, it's efficient enough to run the watch, but honestly, how many SwiftUI views can you fit on the watch screen? Like there's not that many of them, whereas a Mac app can have a ton of them. So this supposed system that's going to like turn everything into a data structure and run it through this machine and make views to be an efficient way, does that actually work when I have a table with like millions of cells and stuff? Or does it fall over because AppKit has had multiple decades of optimization and actually, NS table view or even hell UI collection view actually do this much better because they've been forged in the crucible of years and years and years of making this faster and having a WWDC session telling you how to make it faster and then repeating that cycle, right? So that's why SwiftUI is a question mark, but there is a bunch of stuff in favor of it. It is good at things that other frameworks are not good at. It does have lots of technical things that in theory can make it very fast and efficient without much developer effort. It does have the potential, as Apple keeps pushing, to be less bug prone because you don't have to worry about as many states of the interface and having things be immutable versus mutable and declarative versus imperative. Like Apple really pushes the benefits, and they are real and they do make sense and they could all work out, but we don't know if that's the case yet, right? All we know is that right now it's young, it's got bugs, it doesn't have all the features we need. Some parts of it are in fact slow when you try to do big things, but it's too early to make a call, right? And then Catalyst is kind of the same thing. Catalyst is a known quantity. We know about UIKit, but there's a bunch of crap you can't do without falling down to AppKit. And until very recently, it's been very difficult to make an app that can fool a actual experienced Mac user into thinking it's not a Catalyst app, right? The scaling thing helps a lot, but there are other sort of telltale signs. And especially if you're bringing an app from the iPad or the iPhone, it's very easy to tell that it's not a native Mac app because no one would ever make a Mac app like that because that's not how Mac apps work. So the Mac as a platform is in a difficult situation. Part of that situation is just, Apple in terms of like, well, how important is the Mac to any one person? But part of it is Apple's own doing and that they don't have a clear message on what should I be doing instead of Electron. So Electron really starts to feel like a safe, wise, and reasonable choice until Apple gets its crap together.
Yeah, it's such a crummy state of the Mac, right? And to bring this briefly back to 1Password, I'm still not convinced that Catalyst wouldn't have been an acceptable answer. So it would be straight UIKit on iOS and iPad, and then 90% UIKit wherever possible on Mac OS, and then dropping back to AppKit or something like that if necessary. I mean, if the backend really and truly is Rust, and if it really and truly does 90% of the heavy lifting, then I got to imagine 90% of 10% is still not too much code. You know what I mean? Like it shouldn't have been that thick a shim over their Rust backend. But not, be that as it may, again, I can armchair quarterback all the time.
I mean, honestly, I think they should have used AppKit. They already knew how to use it. They already had a giant existing app. Like AppKit is the right answer here. I know it doesn't feel good from an engineering standpoint, but that is the right answer right now.
I mean, they would have had to throw away the existing AppKit app, but getting back to the core thing being in Rust, like, granted, you're going to need to put something new on top of it because we all know, despite everyone's attempts to be disciplined, your backend is tied to your front end in ways that are difficult. So I totally understand that you got to throw away your existing AppKit app, probably all of it, right? You've got a new core, right? But on top of that new core, how thick would the layer of AppKit, UIKit, or SwiftUI have to be? They tried to do SwiftUI, didn't work out for whatever reasons. If they had tried to do an AppKit layer on top, certainly, more work than Electron because Electron is shared across all the platforms and you just do it once, great. But how complicated would that be? I've used 1Password. Last 1Password version I had was 3, I think. I think I just deleted it actually a couple of months ago because I realized I hadn't launched it in a while, or maybe it had the circle with a line through it saying it doesn't run on this OS anymore. But I don't know how complicated 1Password is. How much UI does 1Password have? But pick any API, and it's plausible that would have been a similar amount of work to use AppKit, Catalyst, or SwiftUI on top of that core. All of those options are obviously way more work than doing zero work and just using Electron everywhere, right? So again, I can kind of understand why the company went with what they went with. But I also mostly agree with Marco that if you had done it with AppKit, in terms of customer experience, currently that's a no compromise solution. Like I was trying to think of, is there anything you can't do in AppKit? I think maybe with some of the stuff they're adding to SwiftUI, some things are actually a little bit more difficult in AppKit, like some of the SwiftUI views would be difficult to synthesize in AppKit. But in general, I don't think there's anything you literally can't do in AppKit. So from a customer's perspective, they don't need to know your core is in Rust. Who cares? Your UI is in AppKit. They don't need to know you rewrote it all, especially if you change it and it looks a little bit different for the version 8 or whatever. And that's fine. If you did it in Catalyst, I do wonder if we would be having this exact same podcast, only instead of us complaining about them going to Electron, we'd be complaining that they went to Catalyst. Because Catalyst apps also have their own kind of, especially if your goal is to share that code with iPad and the iPhone, you'd be like, oh, why is these menu items weird? Why don't the keyboard shortcuts work? Like there's tons of reasons to complain about Catalyst because it's also young, right? And then SwiftUI, they would still be writing it because there's like 3 things they needed to do that it doesn't currently do, and good luck trying to wedge that in, right?
And SwiftUI is buggy too. Like it's not.
Yeah.
If you look at the way SwiftUI does, like even like certain transitions, like navigation controller transitions, certain animations, certain like SwiftUI actually it does a lot of things in different ways than the native UI frameworks on its own platform does them. Like if you write certain things in UIKit or AppKit versus SwiftUI, they actually sometimes behave in small different ways. And so like this is why I think the idea of cross-platform design and having a shared framework between very different kinds of platforms. How long has our industry been trying to do this? And when has it ever worked with the sole exception of the web browser? The web browser is the greatest cross-platform, cross-UI, everything. But once you get into apps, native apps, the platforms are so different in big and small ways. A few big ways and 1,000 small ways. That I don't think it's even possible to expect any cross-platform toolkit to ever really make great UI experiences. I think whatever you write for a phone or for a watch or for the Mac, or for the PC, or for the web browser. Those are all very different targets, and they all have different UI conventions, different expected behaviors by users, entirely different environments and needs and priorities. And so you're right, Catalyst apps do suck, and the reason they suck is not because they're built on web technologies. It's not because they don't have all of the same implementation details, or almost any of the same implementation details as something like Electron. They suck because they're running iPad code on the Mac, and it doesn't feel right, and it doesn't behave right in lots of little tiny ways. And that's native code. It's running. It's not being interpreted or emulated. That's native code running in what is kind of a native framework, but it's kind of for the wrong platform. But I don't think this dream of having cross-platform, we're just going to write one app and it's going to be the same and it's going to be great everywhere. I don't think that's ever achievable because platforms aren't the same. And to be great on a platform requires it to adopt to all the platform's little behaviors and priorities and things, which are all going to be different. So that's why I think a company like 1Password, they have the resources, they have the engineering, they have the staff. They got to where they are today in part because they made native apps on multiple platforms that were good. And the idea of transitioning that to one shared app, no matter what framework they're using, is not going to be good. It's not going to be as good as what they had before. It's not going to feel right. Everything's going to feel like a web view because that's what it is. But even if they wrote it all in native code, if they still had the exact same UI behavior and layout and everything across all platforms, it would also still feel and work poorly. Different platforms are different for reasons, and they're always going to be. And so if you're going to have an app on multiple platforms and you care a lot about the experience being good, I think you have to write it natively on each platform.
That's another argument. What you just said is kind of another argument for Electron, unfortunately, because of all the things you listed of like it feeling native or whatever. The web, as you noted, is a sort of common interface across all platforms that it has its own conventions in language, blue underline words, click on and you take you places. There's an address bar, back and forward, reload. Like there's this whole other miniature world of UI conventions that exist within the web. And obviously it's not as consistent as a single OS, what people are familiar with. And the second thing the web has going for it is good web browser engines essentially embed native controls, like the text fields. When you hit Control A in a text field, which is like an Emacs key binding that works because the NS text field from Next was written by a bunch of Emacs users. So Control A works in text fields on the Mac OS X as long as you're using a Cocoa API, right? Does that work in web browsers? I'm pretty sure it does. Casey, you need to go test this for me.
Beginning of line?
Yep, it does. It does.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. Same thing with buttons. They may not look like native buttons, but very often, they were historically native buttons. Now, because of CSS stuff, they may be a little bit weird or whatever. Pop-up menus, scrolling regions, text editing regions. Most web browser engines, most good ones these days, try to use native controls within them, right? Catalyst uses quote-unquote native UI controls, which do not behave like Mac controls. They behave like iPad and iPhone controls. And the iPad and iPhone, until recently, didn't even have a cursor, right? And so it's a totally different interface paradigm. And an Electron app, the two things that I was going for is, one, it might actually feel more native, and two, the parts that don't feel native feel like web, which at least is an interface that people look at and say, oh, they code switch, they mode switch, whatever. They're like, oh, this is like a web UI. Like I feel like I do that when I use Slack. Like when I'm using Slack, it's not like I feel like I'm using a web browser, but I'm in web app mode. And I think a lot of Mac users we've been used to that since we have web browsers, because basically, maybe 50% of the windows on our computer are web windows, right? Where the whole world inside those windows is the web page language, right? And then the Mac stuff is outside of it. And so when I go to Slack, I'm into the web mode. If a Catalyst app lands on here and it doesn't respond to any of my keyboard commands or focus commands in the text fields, and I can't tab from text fields, and the date picker is some weird Wheel of Fortune thing that I don't even understand, that's not web, that's not Mac, and it feels worse. I don't want that at all, right? So again, Electron is not giving you the best experience. I agree with Marco. You want the best experience, you write it in AppKit, and or hell, AppKit with Swift UI inflected, which I think is also, I feel like that's the second choice. If we had to rank these, AppKit will feel the most native because it is the most native, but of course everyone thinks that API is dead or dying. AppKit with Swift UI views, I think, is the best technical solution, because every place you can't use Swift UI, just use AppKit, you're fine. But the places where you can get Swift UI, I can tell you, it integrates really well with AppKit. And the places where you get benefit from it, big win. As you all know, use it in the places where it's a big win. It saves you tons of time. And by the way, those views happen to be reusable if you want to use them elsewhere, right? And then I would say a distant third is Catalyst. This is all based on the fact that Apple hasn't really given any guidance about which one of these three is dying, which one of these three is going to lose. Like, what is the ranking? Which one is going to get the boot? Which one is going to die from slow neglect? Which one is going to win? We don't know. But just on the technical merits, AppKit with Swift UI, number one. Swift UI alone did not finish. And Catalyst, third place. And in that soup, though, I feel like Electron, the choice of Electron, which is make the user experience worse for users and get everyone to complain, but potentially get everyone over the hump, and eventually people just stop complaining. And if this actually does the work the way you say, where, oh, now we can do features more quickly, well, then prove it by rolling out features more quickly, and maybe people start to get happy. Or maybe they still grumble, and then you buy yourself a year or two where you can have your mea culpa post and say, we heard you, and now that it's clear that we shouldn't be using Electron on the Mac, it's also become more clear that insert framework here is the future of APIs on the Mac, and so we've rewritten the Mac client using that API.
Before we go, I hear what you guys are saying, and I agree with you, but I don't know. I feel like my gut tells me, having never used it, that Catalyst is a more viable solution here than I think, especially John, you're giving it credit for. And I am quite possibly wrong there, but my call to action for the listeners is, if you have an app that you're fairly confident is Catalyst, that you use or write, that you think is a really and truly good platform citizen, let me know on Twitter. I'd be curious to hear what that is, because I don't know what the plate of Catalyst apps is. Like, I know the ones that we all hate on the Mac that Apple ships, like Home, which honestly is garbage on iOS too, but that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, Home is terrible everywhere. Bad example.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But that's exactly my point. Like Home, and I'm sure there's a couple others that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But
well, Messages is probably the most used Catalyst app, if I had to guess.
That's true. And that still has a couple of quirks in Big Sur, but for the most part, I think is pretty good. But yeah, if there's a Catalyst app that you use or write that you genuinely believe is really and truly awesome, I'd be curious to hear about that on Twitter. So please let me know.
Yeah, Catalyst has, like, there's no reason Catalyst can't be eventually made to be as good as AppKit with all the features. It's just not there yet, because it's only been a few years since it's been on the Mac platform, and like stuff doesn't work yet, drag and drop, or the cursor doesn't work the right way, or the menu bar stuff's not the same. Like, all of these, SwiftUI is the youngest, obviously, and it's got the farthest to go, but there's nothing technically stopping either Catalyst or SwiftUI from eventually being the API on the Mac platform. It's just neither one of them is right now, right? And so we're faced with the reality, and I gave SwiftUI, I did not finish because I just feel like it's too young and too ready. But and I rank Catalyst below AppKit with SwiftUI mixed in. Like, that's one of the beauties of SwiftUI is it's really easy to mix in with AppKit. You can also mix in SwiftUI, obviously, in a Catalyst app, and you can mix AppKit in with the Catalyst app too. But I feel like 3 APIs is too many. In a single app. So if you have to mix them, AppKit with SwiftUI just makes so much sense, because you can just smell when this is going to be a place where SwiftUI is going to be awesome, and where it's not, you're in AppKit and you can literally do anything and you're fine, right? But Catalyst, it's a much more difficult balancing act. So I feel like we just have to wait to see how this all shakes out. Right now, Catalyst is in the lead, technically, because it has more features, and you can make a more convincing, more complicated Mac app with Catalyst than you can with SwiftUI. But AppKit, obviously can do everything and is, hugely mature and has good performance. And eventually, Microsoft and Adobe did rewrite their crap using this API. So yeah, it's probably going to be around for a while. So that's why I just keep looking at SwiftUI and Catalyst and wondering how that's going to shake out. But in the meantime, like, again, I don't use 1Password. I bought it a couple times, decided it wasn't for me. I just used iCloud Keychain for a variety of reasons, and I'm glad that iCloud Keychain is getting better. But I will say that every day I use Slack and other Electron apps that I consider good Electron apps. And I have to say, a good Electron app doesn't bother me too much, but it should definitely bother Apple.
And I'll say, like, I'm still using 1Password even throughout all this, because iCloud Keychain would be the obvious thing that I would go to instead. But I don't trust Apple yet to have the functionality I need consistently in that product yet. Right now, I use iCloud Keychain as like a convenience. Like, if I fill in a password on a web form from 1Password and Apple offers to save it, I say yes. And the next time I go to that site, it might fill it in. Sometimes. It might not. It also seems broken on my phone forever for some reason. Like, iCloud Keychain just never works properly on my phone. Works great on all my other devices except my phone.
It's because it's too small.
Yeah, maybe. But my battery life is getting bad fast.
It's because it knows you have 1Password installed and it's angry.
Yeah, right.
It's vindictive.
Yeah, so I don't like iCloud Keychain yet. I think it might eventually get good, but it's not good enough and stable enough and consistent enough for me yet. It still doesn't have a lot of features I like with 1Password. And of course, there is the cross-platform thing that is always going to be kind of an afterthought for Apple if it exists at all. So I want to keep using this product, and I probably will keep using this product. I'm just going to have more paper cuts now. And that's unfortunate. And I hope they can find a way not to do that, or at least to reduce those or eliminate those paper cuts. But I think some degree of that is inevitable with all Electron apps, and if not Electron, as I was saying a minute ago, with all cross-platform apps. Like, if you don't have native UIs that were really written like with the platform they're running on in mind, with a significant amount of native code on each platform, I don't think you can make great experiences. I think you can make acceptable experiences, it's hard to make great experiences. The most common Electron app I use is Slack. I use it all day, every day, and it's not a great experience. It's fine, but it's not great.
Yep.
And Slack, I feel like, is even more excusable as an Electron app because it has such a much larger amount of UI. Like there's so much UI in Slack. So many different kinds of screens, so many different modes the UI can be in, so many different, levels and threads, and it's like there's so much UI in Slack. That is more excusable to me to be an Electron app.
And it's a server-side app. Like everything you do talks to a server. So it being web-based technology is like, okay, I can see that.
Right. Yes. But 1Password, I think the conception of it that I have is that the amount of UI in this app is significantly smaller than Slack. Now, that being said, in all the different directions they're going as their focus on, business enterprise kind of features, maybe that's all changing for a bunch of stuff I'll never use. And that's why it's extra frustrating.
Would you like to save your screenshots in 1Password?
1Password can now back up your entire computer.
I just got that prompt today. I'm like,
from Dropbox,
yeah. Dialogue, yeah. Because I was on some, like, one of the kids' accounts on a computer that they don't use normally. I'm like, would I like to save my screen? I'm like, oh, this is a Dropbox dialogue? What the heck? Because I've long since dismissed it and told Dropbox to shut up on all my computers. Yeah, please, 1Password, do not offer to save all our screenshots.
Dropbox needs your root password to enable certain features. Oh yeah? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Let's hope 1Password doesn't go the way of Dropbox. But unfortunately, looking at the direction they're going as a company for focusing a lot on the business market and everything, I think it's going to be an uphill battle to not go that direction. And so I hope they don't. But yeah. Anyway,
but as a final note, I mean, at least Marco and I, we spent a lot of this time talking about 1Password because it's a product and company we love so darn much. And in the defense of 1Password, this is the first public beta of 1Password 8, and 3 1Password employees have been hanging out in the chat, including both founders. Certainly this entire segment, if not the entire episode. So they obviously care, and I don't think. I don't get the feeling that they're just in here trying to do some sort of damage control. I really genuinely believe that they care, and that's why we care. And I hope that continues to be the case, because I agree that I fear that 1Password's heading for a Dropbox fall into irrelevance, and I really hope that that's not the case.
I wouldn't even say irrelevance. I would just say just very different priorities than what all the consumers who started using it really want out of it.
And that's true. That's fair.
Thanks to our sponsors this week, 1Password. No, actually, it was Linode, Mack Weldon, and Squarespace. And thanks to our members who support us directly, you can join atp.fm/join. We will talk to you next week.
Now the show is over. They didn't even mean to begin, 'cause it was accidental. Oh, it was accidental. John didn't do any research. Marco and Casey wouldn't let him, 'cause it was accidental. Oh, it was accidental. And you can find the show notes at atp.fm. And if you're into Twitter, you can follow them at CASEYLISS. So that's Casey Liss, MARCOARMENT, Marco Arment, SIRAC, USA Syracuse. It's accidental. They didn't mean to. Accidental. Tech podcast so long.
So my bike was stolen a few days ago.
Well, it's all coming up Millhouse for you this week, huh?
Good thing you had an AirTag on it, though.
Right?
Right?
Oh, wow. Oh, wait, is this real? Oh, now I'm really excited.
So this was incredible. So Tiff was showing at an art show here in town, it was great. It was a big deal. It was huge. I'm very proud of how it went for her. She was great, and stuff went well. It was great. Anyway, Tiff was doing this art show. I was sitting at the booth with her for the second half of this day, and I was riding my bike back and forth occasionally back to the house to let hops out or do other pick up stuff, whatever. I was parking my bike 15 feet from where I was sitting. It was in eye shot. Did we figure out if that's a word? Is eye shot a word?
This is a new one. This is not like heartened.
I guess within view. So it was within eye shot, and I don't usually lock my bike in town because it's a beach town. That you can't bring bikes on the ferry, so there's nowhere for a bike to really go. And so bikes don't usually get stolen for profit. Like they get stolen usually by drunk idiots who are about to miss the last ferry of the night. And so they rush to grab whatever bike they can find. They ride to the ferry and they dump it somewhere near the ferry. And so then the next morning, everyone goes in the town Facebook group and posts like, hey, there's this bike in front of my house. Whose is this? And then like someone else would be like, oh, I know, that's Bob's bike. Because everyone knows it's a small town. So this is like the environment that we operate in here. So normally I don't even lock my bike if I'm just like going out to, a grocery store or something, because there's not a real theft problem for like in the way that you would usually think of one. So I thought AirTags would be perfect for this because usually, again, the problem is not professional bike thieves coming up with an angle grinder and cutting your U-lock to steal your bike for profit. All you need to know is, okay, my bike is not where I left it. It's probably somewhere stupid. Where is it? That's all you need to know. So I thought AirTags were great. So when I got my first AirTags earlier in the summer, I put one in discrete locations on many common objects, including my bike, and figuring that, hey, this could be good for a passive environment like this. And also, the lack of like true GPS or cellular in them wasn't a big problem because I don't think there's anywhere on this entire island that an object is likely to be more than 20 feet from an iPhone for very long. We have like very tightly packed houses and tons of people walking around all the time. So, the iPhone location basis of them is also going to be, I think, pretty accurate. So anyway, at this art fair with Tiff, my bike is parked 15 feet away within eye shot, and within an hour and a half period, like between 3:30 and 5 on this day, we finish up the art fair. Tiff's packing up. I go to get my bike. I'm like, where's my bike? I parked it here, right? I'm looking around like, where is it? And this was in a bike rack full of other bikes. Like, I'm like, where did my bike go? Did somebody steal my bike in front of me? And I didn't notice? Yes, they did. So at some point, someone in this, art fair, like there's a lot of, foot traffic. Someone at some point walked up to my bike and just took it out of the rack.
That's bananas.
So I'm like, all right, well, let's see. So I opened up the Find My app and Find My Bike. It instantly showed a point on the map that was a few blocks away. I'm like, by the ferry. So I was like, okay, but it's like, okay, this happened between 3:30 and 5 p.m. Could somebody have really been that bombed at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon? I mean, it turns out
challenge accepted.
Yeah, on Fire Island, yes. But also, I'm like, this wasn't even the last ferry. They like, this was like 4 o'clock. The ferries run till like midnight. Like this, like it's not. Anyway, so I walked over. I'm like, this will be amazing if my bike is actually where this says it is. I walk, towards it on the map, and sure enough, the AirTag had exactly located my bike, which was parked in front of a storefront and next to a couple other bikes near the ferry. I have no idea how this happened, like in front of me without me noticing. It doesn't even make sense because in the context of this art fair, there was so little like. It was hard to even walk down the sidewalk, let alone bike down it. Like, because there's so much traffic, it's like walking through Times Square. Like, but on a much smaller scale, obviously. Like, I don't know why somebody did this, but the fact is, my bike was indeed stolen in the stupid way that bikes get stolen here. The AirTag worked perfectly, and it let me find it in 10 seconds after I started looking. Like, wait, where's my bike? It's not here. Okay, find my. Boom. It's a few blocks that way. Okay, walk right to it. It's exactly where it says it is. So. Here is my success story with AirTags. If you happen to have the very strange needs and priorities that I do for bikes here, they work really well for that.
Keep an eye on your bike, too.
Why?
Yeah, that might be a good idea.